Not a bad smell, exactly, but strange, faintly metallic like rain hitting hot pavement. I noticed it when I came home from work one night. It hung in the air, faint and elusive, disappearing the moment I tried to pinpoint its source. I assumed it was from the apartment above mine. Maybe someone was cleaning with industrial chemicals or burning something unusual in the kitchen. I left my windows open to air it out, but the smell didn't go away. The next morning, I smelled it in the shower, faint but unmistakable. My shampoo masked it for a moment, but as soon as the water hit the tiles, it came back stronger. It clung to me all day at work, followed me to the coffee shop, lingered in the car on the way home. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was convinced I was imagining it, until I heard the sound. It was barely audible, like a distant hum, but it pulsed, faint and rhythmic. I checked everything, the refrigerator, the vents, even the light fixtures. Nothing. I turned off every electronic device, stood in the center of the room, and held my breath. The hum didn't stop. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. The hum seemed to vibrate through the walls, rising and falling in waves. It wasn't loud, but it was relentless, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. That was when the dreams began. In the first one, I was walking through a vast, empty field under a sky that seemed too large. The grass beneath my feet was pale gray, soft as silk, and the air carried the same metallic tang as the smell in my apartment. At the center of the field stood a structure, a tall, narrow tower made of interlocking black stones. It rose impossibly high, tapering into the clouds like a needle. As I approached, I noticed the hum growing louder, resonating in my chest. I reached the base of the tower and saw a door. It was smooth and featureless, blending seamlessly into the stone. When I touched it, the hum stopped. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. The room was dark, and for the first time in days, the hum was gone. But the smell was stronger. I tried to ignore it. I scrubbed the floors, lit candles, sprayed air freshener until the room smelled like an artificial spring meadow, but the metallic tang seeped through everything. By the end of the day, my head was pounding. When I closed my eyes that night, I was back in the field. The tower loomed in the distance, dark and imposing, its sharp edges slicing through the sky. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through my bones as I walked. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air felt thick, like I was underwater. My hand moved on its own, pressing against the smooth surface of the stone. The door slid open, revealing a staircase spiraling upward into darkness. I climbed. The stairs felt endless, each step echoing faintly in the narrow space. The hum grew louder, transforming into something almost melodic. It wasn't unpleasant. If anything, it was soothing, like a lullaby sung in a language I didn't understand. When I reached the top, I stepped into a circular room bathed in pale, silvery light. In the center of the room was a mirror. It was enormous, its frame made of the same black stone as the tower. The surface wasn't reflective, though. It shimmered, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a gentle breeze. I stepped closer, drawn to it. The hum became a chorus, voices overlapping in a strange, hypnotic harmony. When I reached the mirror, I saw myself for something that looked like me. The reflection wasn't perfectly aligned. When I tilted my head, it didn't move quite right. Its eyes were too bright, its smile too wide. And then it spoke. "You're almost ready." I woke up gasping, my heart racing. The hum was back, louder than ever. It filled the apartment, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my chest. I stumbled out of bed, searching for the source, but it was everywhere and nowhere at once. The metallic smell was overpowering now, sharp and acrid, burning my nose. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, my reflection stared back with that same too-wide smile. "You're almost ready," it whispered. I smashed the mirror with my fist, the glass shattering into 1,000 jagged shards. But the reflection didn't disappear. It remained, fragmented and distorted in the broken glass, its smile stretching wider, its eyes glowing faintly. I ran, out of the bathroom, out of the apartment, into the street. The night was quiet, the air cool, but the hum followed me, faint and distant, like it was coming from inside my own head. I didn't go back. I moved into a friend's spare room, leaving everything behind. For a while, things seemed normal. The hum faded, the smell disappeared, and I started to believe it had all been some kind of hallucination. Until last night, I was brushing my teeth, staring into the mirror, when I saw it again. The reflection didn't move when I did. It smiled that same too-wide grin and whispered, "It's time." When I turned around, the door to my room wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was a staircase spiraling upward into darkness, and I could hear the hum, louder than ever, calling me home. Let's start a new story. The attic was the last place I wanted to clean. Dust hung in the air like cobwebs spun in sunlight, and the place reeked of mildew and something faintly sour. But I couldn't put it off forever. My mom had left me the house when she passed, and I needed to get it in shape to sell. The journal was inside an old steamer trunk tucked beneath piles of yellowed newspaper. Its leather cover was cracked with age, the edges worn smooth. No name, no title, just a single word embossed on the front: Watcher. I opened it, expecting to find my mom's handwriting, maybe old sketches or notes. Instead, the pages were filled with short, frantic entries, written in a hand I didn't recognize. The ink was smudged in places, but I could make out enough to feel uneasy. It saw me today. I think it knows. Keep the curtains shut. Always shut. Don't let it hear your name. I flipped through quickly, looking for context, but there was no explanation, just warnings. One after another, some scrawled so fast they trailed off into illegible scratches. Toward the end, the handwriting grew shakier, almost childlike. It's inside. I shut the journal and tossed it back into the trunk. It wasn't my problem, I decided. Just some old ramblings, probably my mom's idea of a creepy story she'd never finished. I didn't need another thing to stress about. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint, like nails dragging lightly across wood. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or a stray cat, but the sound was coming from inside the house. I got out of bed, heart thudding, and grabbed the flashlight I kept in my nightstand. The noise grew louder as I crept down the hallway, stopping just outside the living room. The curtains, they were moving. I froze, staring at the long, heavy drapes as they rippled faintly, though no windows were open. The scratching stopped, and then from somewhere deep within the folds of fabric, I heard it, a breath. I slammed the door to the living room shut and barricaded myself in my bedroom. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, my ears straining for the slightest noise. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Stress, lack of sleep, my nerves getting the better of me. I didn't even go into the living room. I left the curtains as they were and spent the day focusing on anything else. But by that evening, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The journal was on the kitchen counter. I hadn't brought it there. It was open to a page near the middle, the words underlined in thick, heavy strokes. It likes the dark. I don't remember pulling the flashlight from the drawer, but I remember gripping it so tight my knuckles turned white. The sun was setting, and shadows stretched long and thin across the walls. The living room door was open. I hadn't opened it. The curtains hung still now, but the air in the room felt wrong, thick and heavy, like it was pressing against me. I told myself to leave, to turn around and walk out the front door. Instead, I stepped forward. The flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on the curtains. For a moment, nothing happened. Then they moved, not like before. This wasn't the soft ripple of fabric caught in a breeze. This was deliberate, slow. The folds parted as though something on the other side was reaching through. I saw a hand. It wasn't a hand, though, not really. It was too long, the fingers jointed in places they shouldn't be. Its skin glistened like oil, black and slick, reflecting the light in strange patterns. And then it turned. It didn't move toward me. It didn't have to. It just tilted slightly, revealing the faintest curve of a head, a gleaming sliver of an eye. That was enough. I ran, not stopping until I was outside, panting on the front lawn. I didn't go back in that night. But the next morning, I found the journal again. This time it was on the hood of my car, the leather cover glistening with dew. The page it was open to wasn't written in ink anymore. The words were scorched into the paper, edges blackened and curling. "It's waiting for you." I tried to leave after that, packed a bag, locked the doors, and drove to a motel an hour away. But even there, I couldn't escape it. That night, I heard the scratching again. It started faint, coming from the walls, then the floor, then the door. I didn't open it. When morning came, I found the journal on the bedside table, a new entry scrawled on the inside cover. "You can't leave until it chooses someone else." I don't know what that means. The lights in the house have started to flicker, and the shadows on the walls seem to move when I'm not looking directly at them. The curtains stay closed now. I don't go near them, not even during the day, but the scratching is getting louder. In the journal? The journal is full now. Every page is written on, the words spilling into the margins, overlapping in a frantic, illegible scrawl. Except for the last page. It's blank. I think it's waiting for me to write in it, and I think I know what happens if I do. Let's start a new story. When I saw the name on the caller ID, I froze. Dale Kensington. Dale had been my best friend in high school. We'd done everything together. Road trips, late-night movies, ditching school for days at the lake. But that was years ago, and Dale was dead. He'd been dead for over a decade. Quel accident. I'd been at his funeral, sitting in the front row, crying so hard I could barely see. The phone buzzed again, the name glowing on the screen like it was daring me to answer. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but then I did something I still can't explain. I answered. At first, there was nothing but static, the kind of low, crackling noise you might hear on an old radio. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling. The static shifted, and then a voice came through. "Jake!" My blood ran cold. It was Dale's voice. "This isn't funny," I stammered. "Who is this?" The voice faltered. "Jake, it's me. I need your help." My mouth was dry. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be Dale. I hung up without another word, my hand shaking as I set the phone down. For a long time, I just stared at it, half expecting it to ring again. But it didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sound of his voice, the way it cracked when he said my name. It was him. I was sure of it. But how? I tried to rationalize it. A prank, a coincidence, someone with a voice that just happened to sound like his. At 3:14 a.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, there was no name, just unknown caller. I didn't answer. But when I checked my voicemail, there was a message. It was Dale again. "Jake, listen to me. Please. You have to come to the house. You remember the house." The house. Of course, I remember the house. It was an abandoned place at the edge of town where Dale and I used to hang out as kids. A crumbling relic of the 19th century, with boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered walls. We'd spent whole summers there, exploring its hidden rooms and making up stories about ghosts and secret passages. It had been our sanctuary, until the night we stopped going. I hadn't thought about that place in years. But now, the memories came flooding back. The strange noises we'd heard from the basement, the way Dale had sworn he'd seen something move in the shadows. That final night, when he dared me to go down there, and I'd refused. I'd never told anyone, but I'd had nightmares about that place for months afterward. The next morning, I tried to put it out of my mind, but the calls kept coming. Every day, always from unknown caller, always Dale's voice. The messages grew more frantic. "Jake, you have to come. It's getting worse. I can't keep it back much longer." By the 5th day, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go to the house. The drive out there felt like stepping into another life. The town had changed so much. New roads, new buildings, but the house was the same. It stood at the end of a dirt path, half hidden by overgrown trees, its windows staring back at me like empty eyes. The air around it felt heavier, colder, like the place was breathing. I parked my car and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my feet. "Dale," I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. The front door was ajar, its hinges rusted and splintering. Inside, the air was damp and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew. The floors groaned under my weight as I moved through the rooms. each one more decayed than the last. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the ceiling sagged like it was ready to collapse. And then I heard it, a faint sound coming from the basement. A low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Dale!" I called again, my voice shaking. The thumping stopped. Against every instinct, I made my way to the basement door. It was the same as I remembered. Heavy wood, chipped paint, a padlock that now lay broken on the floor. The stairs creaked with every step as I descended, the darkness swallowing me whole. At the bottom, I shone my flashlight around the room. It looked just as we'd left it all those years ago. Broken furniture, graffiti on the walls, an old workbench covered in rusted tools. But then my light landed on something new. In the center of the room was a large, circular hole in the floor. It was about 6 feet across, its edges rough and jagged, like it had been ripped open by something strong. The air around it was thick, humming with a low vibration that I could feel in my chest. And then I saw him. Dale was crouched at the edge of the hole, his back to me. His clothes were the same as I remembered from the day he died. Torn jeans, a faded hoodie. But his body was wrong. His limbs were too long, his back hunched at an unnatural angle. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his hair hung limp and matted. "Jake," he said without turning around. His voice was raw, broken. "You came." I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up. He turned to face me, and I stumbled back. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. His mouth twisted into a grimace that might have been a smile. "You left me here," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You left me." I didn't. I stammered, but the words felt weak, meaningless. He pointed to the hole. "It's awake now. It's always been awake. And it's hungry." The vibration grew stronger, the hum rising into a low, guttural growl. Something moved in the darkness below the hole. Something massive, shifting and writhing, its form impossible to comprehend. Tendrils, or limbs, or shadows, reached toward the surface, spreading out like roots. "You have to feed it," Dale said, his voice softer now, almost kind. "It needs someone. It always needs someone." And then he lunged at me. I don't remember how I got out of that house. My legs moved on their own, carrying me up the stairs, through the door, and into my car. I drove until the house was miles behind me, the growling still echoing in my ears. The calls have stopped, but I know it's not over. Every night, I dream of that hole, of the thing inside it. And every morning, I wake up with the same thought. It's still hungry. Let's start a new story. I found it wedged into the crack of my apartment door when I got home from work, its edges worn and stained, as if it had been carried for miles. No postage, no return address, just my name written in shaky, uneven letters across the front. Emma. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe it was meant for another Emma in the building, though as far as I knew, there wasn't one. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was spidery and faint, as though whoever had written it was in a hurry or nervous. The note read, "It's watching. Don't let it see you." I stared at the words for a long time, trying to make sense of them. They didn't feel like a joke, but they didn't feel real either. I glanced up and down the hallway, expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. But it was empty, the faint hum of the overhead lights the only sound. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was someone's idea of a prank. Or maybe it was meant for a different Emma after all. Either way, I tossed the envelope in the trash and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I woke up at 2:44 a.m. with the unmistakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. My room was dark, but the faint glow of the street lamp outside cast long, eerie shadows across the walls. Everything was still, too still. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from the window or the walls. It was coming from inside the room. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The tapping stopped. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, but the beam revealed nothing, just the familiar clutter of my room. The noise didn't return, but sleep was out of the question. I stayed up the rest of the night, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Stress, I thought, or exhaustion. I was busy at work, and moving into a new place always took some adjusting. It wasn't until I stepped outside that I saw it. Another envelope. This one was taped to the inside of my mailbox. It was the same as the first, worn, stained, with my name scrawled on the front. My hands trembled as I opened it, pulling out a note identical to the last. "It's watching. Don't let it see you." I went back inside, my heart pounding. Someone was messing with me. That was the only explanation. I checked every lock and window, making sure the apartment was secure. Then I called the building manager, asking if he'd seen anyone strange around. He hadn't. He promised to keep an eye out, but I could tell he didn't think it was serious. The tapping came back that night. It was louder this time, more deliberate. I sat frozen in bed, clutching my phone, but the sound didn't stop. It moved, first from the corner of the room, then closer, like someone or something was circling me in the dark. When I turned on the flashlight, the sound stopped, just like before. But this time, there was something new. Scratches on the floor. Long, jagged lines, as though sharp claws had raked across the wood. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I skipped work and stayed home, determined to figure out what was happening. I combed through the apartment, checking for any sign of an intruder, but found nothing. The windows were locked, the door secure. The scratches on the floor looked fresh, but there was no debris, no splinters. It didn't make sense. That evening, I left my apartment for the first time in days, hoping some fresh air would clear my head. When I came back, another envelope was waiting for me, taped directly to my door. This one was different. Inside, there wasn't a note, but a photograph. It was a picture of me, taken through my living room window. I was sitting on the couch, staring at my laptop, completely unaware. My blood ran cold. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been inside the building, close enough to take this picture. I called the police, shaking as I explained the situation. They came quickly, 2 officers sweeping the apartment and asking questions. They didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to suggest someone had been inside. They filed a report and told me to call if anything else happened, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. To them, I was just another paranoid tenant. That night, I stayed at a hotel. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the apartment, not after the photograph. I slept for the first time in days, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that feels like a mercy. When I returned the next morning, the apartment felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the faint smell of mildew lingered despite the windows being closed. I stepped into the living room and froze. The walls were covered in scratches. They were everywhere, crisscrossing the plaster like a web. Some were shallow, others deep, but all of them looked fresh. In the center of the room, sitting on the coffee table, was the photograph. This time, someone had written on the back, "You shouldn't have left." I don't know who's leaving the envelopes. I don't know what's making the sounds at night, or why the scratches keep appearing. All I know is that it's not stopping. Last night, I woke up to find the latest envelope already in my hand. My name scrawled across the front in that same trembling script. I don't remember picking it up. Inside, there was a single word: run. I'm not waiting to find out what happens next. I'm writing this from a diner on the highway, my car packed with whatever I could grab before I left. But as I sit here, my phone buzzes with a notification. Unknown number. One new message. I don't want to look. I don't want to know what it says. But I know I will, because no matter how far I go, I can feel it watching me. Let's start a new story. The letter arrived on a day I shouldn't have been home. It was my day off, but I'd planned to run errands, grab coffee, and maybe hit the gym. Anything to avoid the creeping stillness of my apartment. But as I stood at the door, coat halfway on, the rain started. Sheets of it. My umbrella was broken, and the motivation to leave vanished as quickly as it had come. So I stayed, and that's why I saw the mailman. I never saw the mailman. I'd always leave too early or get home too late. But today, through the fogged-up window, I caught him. He wasn't what I expected. Young, thin, with a shock of pale blonde hair that looked almost white under the gray sky. He He wasn't wearing a uniform, just jeans and a jacket. And as he passed my building, he slipped a single envelope into my mailbox. That's it. Nothing else. Curious, I went downstairs, my slippers soaking up water from the floor tiles by the entryway. The mailbox wasn't locked. Never had been. The landlord didn't care, and when I opened it, there it was. The envelope was thick, like it held more than just paper. My name was written on the front in blocky, uneven handwriting, but there was no return address, no stamp. Inside was a single card, folded in half, and a small, shiny key taped to the bottom corner. The card smelled faintly of ash, and when I unfolded it, I found 2 words written in the same uneven handwriting. Come alone. No explanación. No address. Just the key and those words. I should have thrown it away. Any normal person would have, right? But something about the key drew me in. It was old, almost antique, with intricate designs etched into the metal. It looked more like a key to a treasure chest than a door. I turned it over in my hands, felt its weight, and then, for reasons I still can't explain, I decided to keep it. The first strange thing happened that night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the key sitting on my nightstand. The rain had stopped, and the world outside was eerily quiet. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A faint click. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. It sounded like a lock turning, but I lived alone, and my apartment only had 2 locks. The front door and the one on the bathroom. I got up and checked both. Secure. But as I turned back toward my bedroom, I noticed something strange. The key on my nightstand wasn't where I'd left it. It was on the floor, halfway across the room. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, the letter was back. I found it on the kitchen counter, the same envelope, the same card inside. Only now, there was an address written beneath the words. Come alone. The address wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute drive, and I don't know why I felt compelled to go. Maybe it was the weirdness of the key, the strangeness of the letter, or the way my apartment felt smaller and darker every time I looked at it. I grabbed the key and left. The address led to an old warehouse on the edge of town, tucked away behind chain-link fences and rusting machinery. The place looked abandoned, the kind of spot kids would dare each other to explore at night. But when I got closer, I saw the door was slightly ajar and faint lights spilled out onto the cracked pavement. I hesitated. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my sister asking if I wanted to grab lunch later. For a moment, I considered turning around, pretending this never happened. But the key felt warm in my pocket, almost alive, and before I knew it, I was inside. The light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying gently as if something had just brushed past it. The room was empty except for a single wooden table in the center. On it was a box. The box was plain, wooden, about the size of a shoebox, and painted black. The keyhole on the front was small, intricate, and matched the key in my pocket perfectly. The air in the room was heavy, the silence oppressive. I could feel the weight of the warehouse pressing down on me, and every instinct screamed to leave. But my hand moved on its own, pulling the key from my pocket and sliding it into the lock. The moment the key turned, the bulb flickered and went out. For a second, there was nothing but darkness. And then the whispering started. It was soft at first, like wind through a crack in the wall, but it grew louder, more insistent. Dozens of voices, overlapping, too faint to make out the words, but unmistakably human. The box began to rattle. I stepped back, heart pounding, as the lid creaked open. The whispers stopped all at once, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that I could feel in my chest. Inside the box was a photograph. It was black and white, worn at the edges, showing a group of people standing in front of a building. I recognized the building. It was my apartment. The people in the photo were strangers, but something about their faces felt familiar, like I'd seen them in passing, maybe in a dream. They were all smiling, except for the one in the center. That one was me, but it wasn't me. The face was mine, but the eyes were wrong. Too dark, too sharp, staring straight at the camera like they knew I'd be looking. The hum grew louder, and the lights flickered back on. The box was empty now, the photograph gone, but the hum didn't stop. It was coming from inside the building, and it was getting closer. I ran. When I got back to my apartment, the door was wide open. The key was already on the kitchen counter, sitting on top of another letter. I didn't open it, but at night, I hear the whispers, and I know the box isn't empty anymore. Let's start a new story. Strange, vivid fragments, scenes that didn't make sense. A field of tall grass swaying in the wind, its blades unnaturally sharp. A pale hand reaching out from the shadows of an open doorway. A bird with too many eyes perched on a telephone wire, its head twitching as it watched me. Each morning, I woke up feeling more exhausted than the night before. The dreams stuck to me, lingering on the edges of my thoughts, making the world feel slightly off. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't entirely mine, like someone else had planted them in my head. Then I started hearing the whispers. They began as faint murmurs, just as I was falling asleep. They didn't form words, not at first. It was more like the sound of a crowd in the distance, voices overlapping and blending into a low, indecipherable hum. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was overtired, but deep down I knew better. One night, I sat up in bed, heart pounding, as the whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from outside my window or the apartment next door. They were coming from inside my room, from inside me. I got out of bed and turned on every light in the apartment. The whispers stopped immediately, as if startled, but the silence that followed felt watchful, like something was waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning, I found a mark on the wall. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. A dark, jagged shape, about the size of my palm, scratched into the paint above my bed. At first glance, it looked like a random pattern, almost like claw marks. But when I looked closer, I saw it was deliberate. The lines formed a crude, spiraling symbol, something that made my stomach churn just looking at it. I painted over it, pretending that would make it go away. It didn't. By the end of the week, the symbol was everywhere, scratched into the bathroom mirror, etched into the wooden floor beneath my couch, scrawled in black marker on the inside of my closet door. The edges of it seemed to ripple if I stared too long, as though it were alive. I started losing time. It began subtly. I'd glance at the clock and realize hours had passed without me noticing. I'd find myself standing in the kitchen, unsure how I got there. One evening, I woke up in the bathtub, fully clothed, water up to my chest. The drain was open, and the water was ice cold. My hands were pruny, but I had no memory of turning on the faucet. The dreams grew worse, darker. They no longer felt like random fragments. They had purpose now, like a story unfolding. I found myself walking through endless, empty hallways, their walls lined with the same spiraling symbol. Doors stretched up and down the corridors, each one slightly ajar. Something moved behind them, too fast to see, but slow enough to feel. I tried running, but no matter how far I went, the hallway stretched on forever. Then in every dream, I reached the same door. It wasn't like the others. It was larger, darker, with no handle, just the symbol carved deep into its surface. I never tried to open it. I didn't need to. I knew, instinctively, that whatever was on the other side was worse than anything I could imagine. But the door wanted me to open it. The whispers became more insistent. They weren't murmurs anymore. They were words. Disjointed and strange, but words nonetheless. Not yet. It knows. The key is inside. I started waking up with bruises on my arms, scratches on my legs. My reflection in the mirror didn't always move when I did. Sometimes, I'd catch it watching me, its head tilted slightly, its eyes too wide. One night, I locked myself in my room, determined to stay awake. I didn't trust myself anymore, didn't trust my own hands not to betray me. The whispers grew louder, angrier, until they were a roar in my ears. The walls trembled, the lights flickered, and the symbol on the wall burned like an afterimage in my mind. And then, for the first time, I heard the knock. It came from the front door, sharp and deliberate. 3 slow, heavy knocks that echoed through the apartment. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Knock, knock, knock. I couldn't bring myself to look. I knew, somehow, that if I did, the door wouldn't be empty. Something would be waiting on the other side. Something that had been waiting a very long time. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. A vacuum that pressed against my skull. Slowly, I turned my head toward the door. It was open, not wide, just enough for a sliver of darkness to spill into the room. I stared at it, my breath coming in shallow gasps, waiting for something to step through. Nothing did. I don't remember falling asleep. I don't even remember getting up to close the door. But when I woke, the door was shut, and the symbol was on the ceiling above my bed, larger than ever. The dreams have changed again. Now, when I reach the dark door, I hear something on the other side. A low, guttural sound like breathing, but not human. It's closer now. Each time I dream, I can feel it pressing against the door, waiting for me to let it out. I'm not sure how much longer I can resist, because the whispers have stopped telling me to wait. Now, they only say one thing. It's time. Let's start a new story. It began with the lily. A single, white lily tucked into a glass vase on the dining table. Maya wasn't one for flowers. She said they were a waste, expensive, temporary, too fragile to justify the effort. I bought her a bouquet once, early in our relationship, and she laughed, more bemused than touched. Just give me a plant, she'd said. Something I can keep alive. But there it was, a lily. Elegant, stark, deliberate. Where'd this come from? I asked, running my fingers over the delicate petals as she sliced vegetables for dinner. She glanced over her shoulder. Oh, a client brought it to the office. I thought it was too pretty to leave there. It was a good answer, just vague enough to feel natural, just believable enough to disarm suspicion. But it didn't sit right. Maya didn't bring things home from work. Not files, not pens, and definitely not flowers. I let it go that night. It was just a flower, after all. But the image stayed with me. The lily standing tall in its vase. A solitary piece of beauty that felt utterly out of place in our home. Then came the lunches. Maya had always been a creature of habit when it came to food. Her workday meal was the same. A turkey sandwich, an apple, and a yogurt cup neatly packed the night before. But one day, as I tidied up the kitchen, I found a receipt crumpled in her coat pocket. It was from a bistro downtown, an expensive one. 2 entrees, 2 drinks. The timestamp read 1:14 p.m., smack in the middle of her workday. I asked her about it that evening. Treat yourself to lunch today? I asked casually, watching her face as she hung up her coat. She paused for half a second, then smiled. Yeah, I needed a break from the usual. Work's been stressful. She kissed my cheek and walked to the bedroom. The conversation closed before it began. But it wasn't just one lunch. Over the next few weeks, more receipts appeared from places she never used to go. Sometimes it was sushi, sometimes a cafe that specialized in artisan pastries. Always for 2. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe she made a new work friend. Maybe she just needed a change of scenery. But the doubt kept gnawing at me, sharp and relentless. And then there was the night of the storm. Thunder rattled the windows as I sat on the couch, flipping aimlessly through channels. Maya was late. She'd texted earlier to say she was working on a big project and wouldn't be home until after 9. But now it was nearly 11, and the storm outside was fierce. I called her phone. No answer. I texted. Nothing. When the clock struck midnight, headlights swept across the driveway, and the front door creaked open. Maya stepped inside, soaked from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face. You okay? I asked, rushing to grab a towel. Yeah, she said, shaking off the rain. Her smile was tight, forced. The roads were awful. Sorry I'm so late. I helped her peel off her coat, my hand brushing something in the pocket. A folded piece of paper. She didn't seem to notice as I took it, slipping it into my own pocket without a word. Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep, I unfolded it. It was a note, handwritten in elegant script. Tonight was perfect. Can't wait to see you again. S. The lily. The lunches. The late nights. It all fell into place. The next morning, I didn't confront her. I needed more. I needed certainty. So I followed her. She left the house at 8:15, as usual, wearing a crisp blouse I hadn't seen before. Instead of heading to work, she drove across town, pulling into the parking lot of a small boutique hotel. My heart sank as I watched her step inside without hesitation. I waited for over an hour, my thoughts racing. When she finally came out, she wasn't alone. A man followed her, his hand brushing hers as they walked to his car. He leaned in close, whispered something that made her laugh, a laugh I hadn't heard in months. They parted ways, and she drove home. By the time she walked through the door, her smile was bright, her demeanor as easy as ever. "How was work?" I asked, my voice steady. "Exhausting," she said, kicking off her shoes. "I'm going to shower." As the water ran upstairs, I sat at the table, staring at the lily still standing in its vase. It looked wilted now, the petals curling at the edges. When she came down, her hair damp and her face freshly scrubbed, I slid the note across the table. She froze, her hand hovering over the back of a chair. "Do you want to explain this?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, though my chest burned. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She sat down slowly, her eyes darting between the note and me. "It's not what you think," she said finally, her voice trembling. "It never is," I replied. And then, like water breaking through a dam, it all came out. His name was Simon. They'd met at a gallery opening months ago. She hadn't planned for it to happen, but he made her feel alive again, she said. "Seen? And me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What was I?" "You're everything," she said, tears streaming down her face. "That's what makes this so hard." Her words felt like knives. I didn't yell. I didn't throw things. I just nodded, stood, and walked out the door. Some people say betrayal feels like fire, burning everything in its path. But for me, it felt like the lily, beautiful at first, but destined to wither. Let's start a new story. It wasn't supposed to be there. I walk this trail every morning. It's a ritual, one I've kept for years. The same route through the woods behind my neighborhood, the same crunch of gravel underfoot, the same swaying trees that creak gently in the breeze. It's where I think, unwind, breathe. The world feels distant out here, small and manageable. But that morning was different. The path had changed. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I reached the usual bend where the trail curves sharply to the left, following the ridge of a shallow ravine. Except instead of curving left, it continued straight. A new path, freshly cleared, the earth still raw and exposed. I stopped, frowning. I knew these woods like the back of my hand. This path hadn't been here yesterday. The logical explanation came quickly. Someone from the town must have extended the trail. Maybe they'd done it overnight. It was odd, sure, but not impossible. Still, something about it unsettled me. The new path was too clean. No roots sticking out of the dirt, no scattered leaves or twigs. Just smooth, untouched earth that seemed to invite me forward. I told myself to ignore it, to stick to my routine, take the familiar path, and leave the new trail for another day. But as I turned to continue my usual route, I felt it. The pull. It wasn't physical, not exactly. Just a low, nagging sense that I needed to see where the path led. I hesitated, then stepped onto the new trail. The woods felt different here, colder. The air had a strange heaviness, damp and still, as if the trees were holding their breath. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves that usually accompanied my walks were absent. The trail twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, doubling back on itself, but always seeming to lead deeper into the forest. The farther I went, the less familiar everything became. These weren't the woods I knew anymore. After about 15 minutes, I began to notice the markers. They were small at first. A scrap of cloth tied to a low-hanging branch, a single stone placed deliberately in the center of the path. But as I walked, they became stranger. A row of feathers, each one stuck upright in the ground. A bundle of twigs arranged in a crude star shape. A shoe, old and weathered, its laces frayed to nothing. I told myself to turn around, to go back the way I came, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the path was gone. The trail behind me had vanished, replaced by dense undergrowth that looked undisturbed, as though no one had walked here in decades. My chest tightened. I tried to retrace my steps anyway, pushing through the thicket, but it was useless. The forest seemed to close in around me, the branches tangling together, the air growing thicker and harder to breathe. Then I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible at first, like someone humming a low, tuneless melody. I froze. The humming grew louder, coming from somewhere ahead of me. It wasn't melodic, not really, just a continuous, droning note that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't see the source, but I knew it was close. Too close. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me farther down the path. The humming followed, always just out of sight, threading through the trees like a living thing. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for air. The silence was worse. Oppressive. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, the trail ended in a clearing. At the center of the clearing stood a tree unlike any I'd ever seen. Its trunk was impossibly tall, its bark blackened and cracked like old leather. The branches reached skyward in unnatural angles, gnarled and wrong, as though they'd been forced into shape by unseen hands. At its base sat a figure. It was humanoid, but only barely. Its body was long and thin, draped in tattered cloth that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its face, if it had a face, was hidden in shadow. The figure didn't move, but I felt its attention, heavy and suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. Then it raised a hand. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and wrong. Its fingers were too long, the joints bending in ways that made my stomach churn. It pointed at me, and though it made no sound, the meaning was clear. Stay. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in its gaze. Seconds, minutes, hours, it felt endless. Eventually, something inside me broke free. A spark of defiance, or maybe just blind panic. I turned and ran. The forest seemed to fight me with every step, the branches clawing at my arms and legs, the air growing thicker and harder to breathe. But I didn't stop. I ran until the trees began to thin, until I burst onto the familiar gravel path of the original trail. The morning sun was blinding, the sound of birdsong almost deafening after the suffocating silence of the woods. When I turned to look behind me, the new path was gone. I haven't gone back to the trail since. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of the tree, of its jagged branches and the figure sitting beneath it. And sometimes, when I wake, I swear I can still hear the humming. Let's start a new story. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just a smudge on the bathroom mirror. I'd been brushing my teeth, half asleep, when I noticed it, a faint mark, almost like the print of a greasy fingertip. I wiped at it with the corner of my towel, but it didn't budge. Annoyed, I leaned closer, and that's when I realized it wasn't on the surface of the glass. It was inside the mirror. It didn't make sense, but I was too tired to think about it. I finished brushing, switched off the light, and went to bed. I barely even thought about it the next morning. It wasn't until the smudge grew that I started paying attention. A few nights later, as I was washing my face, I saw it again. Only now it was larger, about the size of a handprint, pressed against the other side of the glass. It still didn't respond when I wiped at it, but something about the shape made my stomach twist. It wasn't just a hand. It was wrong. The fingers too long, the palms stretched unnaturally wide. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the mirror was old, and the backing was peeling. That was a thing that happened, right? I'd Google it later. Still, I avoided looking at it for too long. It felt silly, but I couldn't shake the unease curling in my chest every time I stepped into the bathroom. By the end of the week, the handprint wasn't just larger, it had moved. I noticed it one morning as I was rinsing my mouth. Instead of being near the top of the mirror, where it had been before, it was now lower near the center, pressed flat against the glass. The long fingers were splayed out like someone or something was trying to push through. That night, I dreamt about the mirror. In the dream, I was standing in front of it, staring at my reflection. The smudge was gone, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Then my reflection blinked, slowly, deliberately, but I hadn't blinked. I tried to move, to step away, but I was frozen. My reflection grinned, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, revealing teeth too sharp to be mine. And then it lifted its hand and pressed it against the glass. The smudge appeared in real time, spreading from the inside. When I woke up, I was standing in the bathroom. The light was off, but the mirror glowed faintly in the darkness, as though something on the other side was radiating light. I stumbled back to bed, my skin clammy and my pulse racing. I convinced myself it was just stress. Work had been rough lately, and I wasn't sleeping well. It was nothing, just my imagination. Mirrors don't glow, and smudges don't move. I was fine, until the glass cracked. I came home from work a few days later to find a thin, jagged fissure running diagonally across the mirror. It wasn't like a normal crack. It didn't spiderweb outward. It was clean, straight, and unervingly deliberate, like something had dragged a claw from one corner to the other. I called a maintenance guy the next morning. He was in and out in 20 minutes, replacing the mirror with a shiny new one. I felt a wave of relief as I looked at the clean glass. No esmujes, no cracks, just me, standing there. But that night, the smudge came back. It started small again, just like before, but this time it spread faster. By morning, the entire lower half of the mirror was fogged with handprints. Hundreds of them, overlapping and twisting, their elongated fingers smearing the surface. I didn't go into the bathroom after that. I kept the door shut, used the sink in the kitchen, and avoided the mirror as if it could reach out and drag me inside. My apartment started feeling smaller, the walls pressing in around me. I couldn't focus at work, and when I tried to sleep, all I could see was the twisted grin from my dream. One night, I came home to find the bathroom door open. I was sure I'd closed it, locked it even, but there it was, yawning wide like an invitation. The air inside was cold, and as I stepped closer, I saw that the mirror was glowing again. Faint, pulsating light seeped through the smudges, illuminating the handprints. And there was something else, a face. Not mine. It was pressed against the other side of the glass, its features distorted as though the surface were water. Its eyes were too large, black pits that stared unblinking into mine. Its mouth was a gaping void, its jaw stretching far beyond what should have been possible. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to move, not fast, but slow, deliberate, as if it was testing the boundaries of its prison. And then it spoke. No sound came from its mouth, but I heard it, deep in my skull, a low, vibrating whisper that felt like nails scraping the inside of my mind. Let me out. I stumbled back, slamming the bathroom door and shoving the heaviest furniture I could find in front of it. I called a friend, trying to explain what was happening, but my words came out jumbled, nonsensical. They told me to leave, to get out of the apartment, but I couldn't bring myself to step outside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, staring at the bathroom door, waiting for it to move, for the thing in the mirror to break free. The next morning, I worked up the courage to open the door. The mirror was gone. The frame was still there, but the glass had vanished, leaving an empty black void. The bathroom smelled damp, like earth and mildew, and when I leaned in closer, I swore I could hear something faint like breathing. I packed a bag and left that day. I didn't tell my landlord why. I didn't care. I haven't gone back, and I don't plan to. But every now and then, when I catch my reflection in a store window or a puddle, I notice something wrong. The smudge is still there, and it's getting bigger. Let's start a new story. Resting neatly on the worn doormat. No envelope, no address. Just a single sheet of paper folded into thirds. I assumed it was junk mail or a notice from the landlord, but when I opened it, the words stopped me cold. Do not turn around. I laughed at first, a nervous, dismissive chuckle, like it was some dumb prank or a flyer for a haunted house. But something about the handwriting, a hurried, jagged scrawl, prickled at the back of my neck. I glanced at the door behind me, wondering if someone had seen me pick it up. Then I froze. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something move, a shadow, just a flicker, a brief ripple in the air behind me. My breath caught. I stared straight ahead, the note crumpled in my hands. Hello, I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. I turned around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, its dim lighting casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Still, the feeling lingered. That weight of being watched, that faint, electric tension along my spine. I locked the door and tried to forget about it. But the letters didn't stop. The next one appeared 2 days later, left on my coffee table while I was out getting groceries. It's closer now. I stared at the note, my hands trembling. The door was still locked, the windows shut. No one could have gotten in. I swept the apartment, checking every corner, every closet, every inch of space where someone could hide. It was empty, but the room felt wrong. The air was heavier, the shadows sharper, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. I didn't sleep that night. The third letter came the next morning, taped to my bathroom mirror. Do not look at it. That was the first time I noticed the reflection. It wasn't obvious at first, just a faint distortion in the glass, like heat waves rising off pavement. But as I stared, the distortion grew sharper, more defined, taking on the shape of something tall and angular, standing just behind me. I spun around. Nothing. When I looked back at the mirror, the shape was gone. I started keeping the lights on all the time, even during the day. My curtains stayed drawn. My phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. I couldn't explain what was happening. Couldn't tell anyone without sounding insane. The letters kept coming, each one more urgent than the last. Don't speak to it. It's learning your voice. It knows you're afraid. By the end of the week, I wasn't leaving the apartment anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows creeping closer with every passing hour. And then, last night, the letters stopped. Instead, there was a knock. It came at exactly 3 a.m., soft and deliberate, echoing through the apartment like a heartbeat. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time. I sat frozen on the couch, my chest tight, every nerve screaming at me to stay still. Then came the voice. Let me in. It was my voice. Low and distorted, like it had been stretched through static, but unmistakably mine. Let me in. It repeated, each word dragging through the air like nails on glass. I clamped my hands over my ears, shaking my head, willing it to stop. The knocking grew faster, more frantic, rattling the door on its hinges. The voice rose into a distorted cacophony, overlapping versions of my own voice shouting, pleading, laughing, and then suddenly silence. When I finally opened my eyes, the apartment was still. The door was intact, the room bathed in the pale glow of my flickering lamp. But the letters were back, dozens of them, scattered across the floor, the furniture, the walls. Each one bore the same message, written over and over in that jagged, frantic scrawl. It's already inside. I don't think I'm alone anymore. The shadows move when I'm not looking. My reflection lags a little longer each time I glance at it. And sometimes when I speak, I hear my voice answer from somewhere else in the apartment. I don't know what it is, but I know it's waiting. Let's start a new story. When I found it, a photo of me sitting on the couch in my living room, staring at my phone. I don't take selfies and I live alone, so the sight of it jolted me awake. My first thought was that someone had hacked my phone, that it was some kind of sick prank. But when I checked the metadata, the timestamp said the photo had been taken 10 minutes ago. I looked around the room, my heart hammering. The lamp was on, casting the same dim yellow glow as in the picture. The blanket was bunched in the same spot on the couch. It was my living room, exactly as it was now, but no one else was there. I locked all the doors and windows, checked every closet and corner, then sat back down with the baseball bat I kept under my bed. The night stretched on, heavy and silent, but nothing happened. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been some kind of glitch. Maybe I'd accidentally taken the photo myself somehow, though I couldn't remember how. I deleted it and tried to forget about it. But the next night, there was another one. This time, it was of me standing in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water. My hair was damp, my pajamas the same ones I just changed into after a shower. The timestamp showed it had been taken 3 minutes ago. The glass in the photo was still in my hand. I ran to the front door, checking the locks again. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Another photo. I opened it with trembling hands. It was of me standing at the door looking at my phone. I dropped the glass. For the next few days, the photos kept coming. Always of me, always from odd angles, always impossibly recent. One of me brushing my teeth. One of me sitting on my bed, staring out the window. One of me standing in the hallway, looking back over my shoulder at nothing. I stopped sleeping, stopped going out. I tried leaving my phone in another room, locking it in a drawer, even smashing it once. But the photos didn't stop. They'd show up on my laptop, my tablet, even my work computer. No matter what device I used, the pictures always found me. I tried showing them to a friend, but the photos wouldn't load when anyone else looked at them. "Are you okay?" my friend asked, her brow furrowed. I wasn't. By the end of the week, the photos started changing. They weren't of me anymore. The first one was of my living room, empty and dark, taken from a low angle like the camera had been placed on the floor. The next was of my hallway, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. Then came one of my bedroom doors, slightly ajar, taken from inside the room. The last photo that night was of the corner of my bedroom ceiling. There was something there, a shape, small, faint, almost human, but wrong, too thin. Its limbs were bent in ways that didn't make sense. Its face a pale blur with two black pits where eyes should have been. The caption under the photo read, "Here." That night, I barricaded myself in the living room, every light in the apartment blazing. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink. Around 3 a.m., the lights flickered. When they came back on, my phone buzzed. The photo was of me, huddled on the couch, staring wide-eyed at the screen. But in the picture, the figure from the ceiling was behind me. Its head was tilted toward my ear, its fingers stretched out toward my shoulder. I screamed and threw the phone across the room. The lights flickered again. When they steadied, I wasn't alone. It was standing in the corner, hunched and crooked, its head tilted too far to one side. Its face was still blurred, its body shifting subtly, like a bad signal on an old TV. It didn't move toward me. It just stood there, watching. I ran, out the door, down the stairs, into the street. I didn't stop running until I reached the 24-hour diner a few blocks away. I didn't go back to the apartment. Not for a long time. When I finally worked up the courage to return, weeks later, it was empty. The landlord said the power had been out since the night I left. My plants were dead, my food rotting in the fridge. But my phone was where I'd left it, lying face down on the floor. I picked it up with trembling hands. There was one new photo. It wasn't of me. It was of the street outside the diner, taken from across the road. The caption read, "You can't run forever." Let's start a new story. It began with a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping that woke me just past midnight. At first, I thought it was the radiator. My apartment building was old, and the heating system had a reputation for clanging to life in the middle of the night. But as I lay in bed, listening, I realized it wasn't coming from the radiator. It was coming from inside the wall. I rolled over, groggy, and stared at the peeling wallpaper next to my bed. The sound was steady, deliberate. Talp, talp, talp. Just pipes. I muttered to myself, pulling the blanket over my head. Go back to sleep. But it didn't stop. Over the next week, the tapping grew louder. It followed me from room to room, always faint, always just on the other side of the wall. I started hearing it during the day, too, though no one else seemed to notice. My neighbor, Mrs. Harlow, dismissed it as old building quirks when I mentioned it to her in the lobby. "You'll get used to it," she said, patting my arm with a leathery hand. But I wasn't getting used to it. By the second week, the sound had changed. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It was scratching. Long, slow scrapes that dragged through the silence like fingernails on a chalkboard. One night, I'd had enough. I grabbed a flashlight and pressed my ear to the wall. The sound was louder now, more frantic, and when I ran my fingers over the plaster, I swore I felt it vibrate beneath my touch. "Who's there?" I whispered, my breath fogging the air. The scratching stopped. I backed away, my pulse hammering. But before I could move farther, it started again, louder and faster this time, as if whatever was behind the wall was trying to claw its way through. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called the building superintendent, Carl, a gruff man with a cigarette-stained voice and a toolbox that looked older than I was. He came up to inspect the wall, muttering under his breath as he ran his hands over the plaster. "No cracks," he said. "No signs of water damage. You sure it's not just rats?" "Rats don't knock," I said, folding my arms. Carl shrugged, unconvinced. "Maybe it's air in the pipes. These old buildings can be tricky. I'll take a look in the crawl space later this week." He didn't. By the weekend, the scratching wasn't confined to the walls anymore. It was under the floorboards, in the ceiling, sometimes even behind the mirror in the bathroom. I started leaving the TV on at full volume, just to drown it out, but it didn't help. And then one night, I heard the whisper. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when it cut through the static hum of the TV like a blade. "Let me out." It was faint, barely audible, but it sent ice through my veins. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The reply came immediately, clear and cold. "Let me out." I bolted upright, the room spinning as adrenaline surged through me. The whisper was coming from the wall next to my bed, the same spot where the tapping had started. I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the wall. The plaster looked the same as always, peeling, yellowed, but the sound continued. "Let me out," the voice said again, more insistent this time. I ran out of the apartment and spent the night at a motel. The next morning, I returned with a hammer and a crowbar. I didn't care about the security deposit anymore. I needed to know what was in that wall. I started in the bedroom, chipping away at the plaster until chunks of it fell to the floor. Beneath it was a layer of old wooden slats, warped and brittle with age. I pried one loose and shone the flashlight into the dark space behind it. At first, I saw nothing but dust and cobwebs. Then the beam of light caught something shiny and metallic. I reached in, my hand trembling, and pulled out a small object. It was a locket, tarnished with age, its chain tangled and broken. I pried it open with my fingernails, revealing a faded black and white photograph inside. The picture was of a little girl, no older than 6, wearing a pinafore dress and staring directly at the camera. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and eerily familiar. The whisper came again, louder now, as if the locket had given it strength. "Let me out." The wall shuddered beneath my hand, and I stumbled back, dropping the locket. It hit the floor with a metallic clink, and for a moment, the entire apartment was silent. Then the wall cracked. It wasn't a small crack. It spread like lightning, jagged and spidering outward from where I'd pried the slat loose. Dust and debris rained down, and the plaster bulged outward, as if something was pushing from the other side. I turned to run, but before I could reach the door, the wall burst open. The thing that emerged wasn't human. It was pale and thin, its limbs too long, its body bent and twisted like it had been crammed into a space too small for too long. Its face was wrong, featureless except for its mouth, which stretched wide in a smile that didn't reach its hollow eyes. "Thank you," it said, its voice a low, wet rasp. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me. It crawled toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, the sound of its bones cracking with each step. "You let me out," it whispered, and for a brief, horrible moment, I thought it was going to touch me. But then it stopped. It turned its head toward the window, as if hearing something I couldn't, and then it was gone, vanishing into the shadows like it had never been there. I left the apartment that night, abandoning everything I owned. I don't know what it was, and I don't care to find out. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. Talp, talp, talp. And the whisper, faint and far away. "Let me out." Let's start a new story. I noticed the number for the first time on the back of my grocery receipt. I'd gone to the store for milk and eggs, a quick trip on a Thursday evening. The cashier, a bored teenager chewing gum like her life depended on it, barely glanced at me as she handed over my receipt. But as I crumpled it into my pocket, a string of numbers caught my eye, printed in red ink beneath the total. 303-57-2222. It wasn't the store's phone number. I knew that much. But something about the way it was printed stood out. Too bold, too deliberate, like it was waiting for me to notice. I ignored it. The next morning, I went to my usual coffee shop before work. As I grabbed my latte, I noticed the same string of numbers scrawled on the sleeve of the cup in black marker. 303-57-2222. I stared at it, my chest tightening. The barista wasn't looking at me. She was busy chatting with a coworker, but when I asked if they'd written it, she shook her head, confused. Must have been on the sleeve already, she said. I threw the cup away without finishing it. By lunchtime, the number was everywhere. On the edge of a flyer stapled to a telephone pole. On the tag of a shirt I tried on during my lunch break. Even on my computer screen at work. An Excel spreadsheet I was working on glitched for a moment. And when it recovered, cell B22 had been replaced by the number. 303-57-2222. I slammed my laptop shut, breathing hard. This wasn't random. That night, I locked my apartment door, turned off my phone, and sat in silence, hoping the number would fade from my mind if I ignored it. But when I went to brush my teeth, it was written in the condensation on the bathroom mirror. I didn't remember turning on the shower. Call it. The letters dripped down the glass like ink bleeding through paper. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, hesitating over the keypad. My instinct screamed at me to stop, but curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pushed me forward. I dialed. The call connected immediately. No ringing, no delay, just a soft click like someone picking up on the first ring. Hello, I whispered, my voice cracking. There was no response at first. Just a faint static, distant and irregular, like the sound of a radio struggling to find a signal. Then came the voice. Do you remember? It was calm, soft, but there was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded familiar, like hearing your own voice in a recording, but slightly off. Remember what? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The static grew louder. You called me before, the voice said, almost wistful. A long time ago. You asked for help. I've never called this number before, I said, clutching the phone tighter. You did, the voice insisted. And now it's time to pay. The call ended abruptly, leaving me sitting in silence. I stared at my phone, half expecting the number to vanish from my recent calls list. But it was there, burned into the screen like a brand. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the world felt wrong. Subtle things at first. My reflection in the bathroom mirror blinked a fraction of a second too late. My neighbor, Mrs. Goldstein, waved at me, but called me Peter. My name isn't Peter. At work, my desk had moved, just a few inches, but enough for me to notice. When I asked my coworker if she'd been by my office, she frowned. You've always sat there, she said, her tone impatient, like I was wasting her time. The number showed up again that evening, this time on my bedroom ceiling. When I turned off the lights, it glowed faintly in the dark. 303-57-2222. I didn't call it again, but it didn't matter. The next time my phone rang, it was from the number. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But some part of me, the part that couldn't look away from car crashes or resist touching a hot stove, picked up. Hello. The voice was different this time. Sharper. Harsher. It sounded like multiple people speaking in unison, their tones layered and discordant. Did you think you could ignore it? They said. Who are you? What do you want? We've been waiting, the voices said, overlapping and distorting. You asked for a door. We built it. Now walk through. What door? I shouted. What are you talking about? There was no answer. The call disconnected, and my apartment plunged into silence again. But as I turned toward the hallway, I saw it. A door. It wasn't there before. It stood at the end of the hall, a tall, narrow thing made of dark wood, its surface polished to a mirror shine. The number was carved into it. 303-57-2222. I approached slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, a cold brass thing that felt too smooth under my fingers. I turned it. The door swung open with a sound like distant thunder. Behind it wasn't my hallway. It was a void, not darkness, something deeper, an absence of light, sound, and space. The edges of the doorway shimmered faintly, like the ripples on the surface of a pond. But beyond that, there was nothing. Nothing except the voices. Come through, they said, clearer now, almost eager. You called us? You wanted this. I didn't. I shouted, backing away. I never asked for this, but the voices didn't stop. They laughed, a sound that wasn't joyful but sharp and hollow, echoing inside my skull. You don't remember, but we do. The door began to pull at me. Not physically, but something deeper, as though the void itself was reaching for the parts of me I couldn't see. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The last thing I saw before the void swallowed me was my own reflection in the door, staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. And smiling. I woke up in my apartment. Everything seemed normal: my bed, my phone, even the familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But when I looked in the mirror, my reflection didn't blink, and the number was carved into my skin. Let's start a new story. The first time I noticed the lights, I thought it was the neighbor's kids playing with flashlights. It was just after midnight, and I was in my kitchen, staring at the fridge like it held all the answers to my life. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the appliances, and I wasn't expecting anything unusual. But then, through the window above the sink, I saw them, tiny pinpricks of light, dancing in the woods behind my house. At first, they seemed random, flickering like fireflies. But fireflies don't move like that. These lights darted and spiraled, weaving in patterns too precise to be natural. I figured it was some kids playing around, maybe drones, maybe a prank, and decided to ignore it. After all, I'd only moved here a month ago. Getting worked up over a few weird lights wasn't how I wanted to introduce myself to the neighborhood. The lights didn't stop. Every night, at the exact same time, they'd return. I tried to brush it off at first. I had bigger things to worry about. New job, unpacked boxes, bills piling up. But the more I ignored the lights, the harder it became to convince myself they were harmless, because they were getting closer. By the end of the week, the lights weren't just in the woods anymore. They were in my yard. I noticed them from the living room, glinting faintly in the dark just beyond the porch. They didn't move randomly anymore either. They hovered in a perfect circle, steady and deliberate. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, staring through the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The lights blinked out all at once, leaving me standing alone in the dark. The next day I asked around. I caught my neighbor, Mrs. Jansen, outside watering her flowers and casually brought up the lights. She stopped mid-sprinkle, her face going stiff. "You don't go near those," she said, her voice low. I laughed nervously, hoping she was joking. "Why? Is it some kind of local tradition?" She didn't laugh. "Just stay inside," she said, gripping the hose tightly. "When they come, you lock your doors, close your windows, and don't look." Before I could ask anything else, she turned and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, I didn't lock my doors. I left the porch light on, determined to prove to myself that this was all just small-town superstition. The lights came back. This time, they didn't stay in the yard. I was sitting in the kitchen when I saw the first one, a soft glow just outside the window. It hovered there for a moment, flickering like it was watching me, before darting to the next window. Then another appeared, and another. Within minutes, the house was surrounded. The lights weren't pinpricks anymore. They were larger, brighter, almost blinding as they pressed against the glass. And they were knocking. It wasn't loud, just a faint tap, tap, tap like fingernails on glass. But it was relentless, moving from window to window, door to door, circling the house like a predator testing its prey. I turned off every light inside and crouched in the corner of the living room, my phone clutched in one hand. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? There are lights outside my house. The knocking stopped. The silence was worse. For what felt like hours, I stayed frozen, waiting for something to happen. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek out from behind the curtain. The lights were gone. The yard was empty, the woods still. I'd barely slept that night, and when I woke up, I found something waiting for me on the porch. A small, flat box, wrapped in pale gray paper. There was no note, no markings, just a box. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed to leave it alone. But curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a mirror. The glass was cloudy, the frame simple. But as I turned it over in my hands, I noticed something etched into the back. "You saw us." I dropped the mirror and stumbled back, my pulse racing. When I looked again, the mirror was gone. That night, the lights came back. This time, they weren't outside. I woke up to the sound of tapping, soft, deliberate, coming from inside the house. The lights were in the hallway. They didn't hover randomly now. They moved with purpose, shifting closer with each blink. I could see them through the crack under the door, their glow casting long shadows on the carpet. Then the knocking started again. This time it came from the bedroom door. I pressed myself against the far wall, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until the door rattled in its frame. And then silence. The door didn't open. But when I looked, I saw the lights retreating, their glow fading into the hallway. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, everything was back to normal. The sun was shining, the yard was empty, and the woods looked ordinary again. But when I checked my phone, there was a single notification. A photo. It was me, asleep in bed, taken from the corner of the room. In the background, barely visible in the dark, were the lights. And they were getting closer. Let's start a new story. I moved into the neighborhood 6 weeks ago, a small cul-de-sac on the edge of a sleepy suburban town. The houses were tidy, but a little too uniform, like they'd been stamped out of the ground by a machine. My new neighbors were friendly enough, smiling waves, the occasional chat about lawn care, nothing intrusive. But there was one house that didn't fit. It sat at the very end of the street, set slightly back from the others, with overgrown hedges and peeling paint. The windows were dark, the yard unkempt, and the mailbox hung askew on a rusty pole. On my first night in the neighborhood, I asked my next-door neighbor, Karen, about it. "Oh, that place," she said, lowering her voice as if the house might overhear. "No one's lived there for years. I think the last owner passed away. The bank owns it now. Why hasn't it been sold?" I asked. Karen hesitated. "Weird things happen there," she said, glancing toward the house. "People don't stick around long." I laughed it off at the time. A creepy, abandoned house was almost a requirement for neighborhoods like this. But the more I looked at it, the more I felt something. A weight, a presence, like the house wasn't empty at all. The first real incident happened on a Sunday night. I was out for a walk, enjoying the cool air, when I saw a flicker of light in one of the house's windows. It was faint, like a candle, and gone almost as soon as it appeared. I stopped, staring at the darkened windows, trying to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe. But as I stood there, I noticed something else, a figure in the yard. It was barely visible, crouched behind the hedges, but I could see the faint outline of someone, or something, watching me. My skin prickled as I forced myself to keep walking, pretending I hadn't seen it. When I glanced back, the figure was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, fueled by too many late-night horror movies. But then the noises started. Every night, around 3 a.m., I'd hear faint sounds coming from the direction of the house. A low, rhythmic creak, like a door opening and closing, or footsteps on old wood. Sometimes there'd be a soft tapping, almost like someone knocking, on what I couldn't tell. The worst part was that it wasn't random. The noises always came in threes, 3 knocks, 3 creaks, 3 taps. At first, I thought it was the wind or animals, but it was too precise, too deliberate. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to take a closer look. The street was silent as I approached the house, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air felt colder near the property, the kind of chill that settles in your bones. I hesitated at the edge of the yard, staring up at the empty windows. The house seemed to loom over me, its sagging roof and darkened facade more menacing than I remembered. I was about to turn back when the front door creaked open. Not fully, just an inch, maybe 2. Enough to make my heart pound. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The door swayed slightly, moving in time with the breeze, but I knew what I'd seen. It hadn't been open when I got there. I shined the flashlight toward the door, but the darkness inside swallowed the light. I left in a hurry, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. When I got back to my house, I locked the doors and told myself I wouldn't go near that place again. But it wouldn't leave me alone. The next morning, I found something strange in my yard. A pile of dirt, small but neatly formed, as if someone had been digging. Next to it was a single, withered flower, its petals dry and brittle, like it had been dead for years. The following night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. Not on the house, it was coming from inside. 3 knocks, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the walls. I bolted upright, heart racing, and grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed. I searched the entire house, flipping on every light, but there was nothing. No sign of forced entry, no explanation for the noise. When I returned to my bedroom, my blood ran cold. The window, which I closed and locked before bed, was open. The knocking continued for the next few nights, always at 3 a.m. I called the police twice, but they didn't find anything. The officer who came the second time gave me a pitying look like he thought I was imagining it. Then, 3 nights ago, I woke up to find something new on my doorstep. A small wooden box, painted black and sealed with a rusted clasp. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but I couldn't resist. My hands shook as I pried the clasp open, revealing what was inside. An old photograph, yellowed and torn, of a woman standing in front of the house at the end of the street. Her face was blurred, her features unrecognizable, but I knew it was the same house. On the back of the photo, written in spidery handwriting, were 3 words: "Don't look inside." I don't know what it meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a warning. It was a command. Last night, I heard the knocking again, but this time, it wasn't in my house. It was coming from the house at the end of the street. 3 knocks, followed by silence, then 3 more. I couldn't help myself. I had to see. I crept outside, the cool night air biting at my skin, and approached the house. The door was open again, wider this time, as if inviting me in. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, the beam barely piercing the thick darkness. The air was heavy, stifling, and the smell of damp wood and decay filled my nostrils. The knocking stopped as soon as I entered, replaced by a deafening silence. Then faintly I heard a voice. "Don't look." I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The voice came again, closer this time, a raspy whisper. "Don't look inside." I don't know what it meant. I don't know what I wasn't supposed to see. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight caught something on the floor, a trapdoor, its edges lined with deep, jagged scratches. I haven't gone back. I can't. But every night since, I hear the knocking. It's not coming from the house anymore. It's coming from beneath my floorboards. Let's start a new story. I found a key in a jacket I didn't recognize. It was a plain brass skeleton key, the kind you'd expect to find in an antique shop, scratched and worn with age. It fell out of the pocket when I pulled the jacket off the back of a chair in my apartment. The thing was, the jacket wasn't mine. I stared at it for a while, trying to remember where it could have come from. Maybe I'd picked it up by mistake at a party, or a friend had left it behind. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became I'd never seen it before. And then there was the key. It was heavy in my hand, its metal cool to the touch. I turned it over, inspecting it, but there was nothing unusual about it. No markings, no engravings. Just an old key, plain and unremarkable, except for the fact that I didn't know where it had come from, or what it unlocked. I should have ignored it. I should have tossed the key into a drawer and forgotten about it. But something about it gnawed at me, a quiet insistence I couldn't shake. I decided to try it on my apartment door. It didn't fit. That should have been the end of it, but the key stayed on my mind. Over the next few days, I found myself carrying it everywhere, running my fingers over its worn edges absent-mindedly. At work, I tried it on a filing cabinet. At a friend's house, I tried it on their front door. It didn't fit any of them. One night, I was sitting on my couch, absent-mindedly fiddling with the key, when I noticed something strange. The air in the apartment felt different, thicker, almost like the humidity had spiked, though the air outside was crisp and dry. Then I saw the door. It was in the corner of the living room, where no door had ever been. The frame was narrow, barely tall enough for me to fit through, and the wood was dark, almost black, with deep grooves running down its surface. It looked ancient, out of place against the pale walls of my apartment. My chest tightened as I stood and approached it. I didn't touch it right away. I just stood there staring at it, my heart pounding. The door didn't look threatening exactly, but it radiated something. An unnatural stillness, like the air around it had stopped moving. Then I saw the lock. It was a perfect match for the key. I should have walked away. I should have called anyone, but my hand was already reaching for the key before I could stop myself. The metal slid into the lock with a soft click, and the door creaked open. What I saw on the other side wasn't possible. It wasn't another room, or a closet, or even the hallway outside my apartment. It was somewhere else. The first thing I noticed was the fog. It was thick and pale, curling around the edges of the doorway like smoke. I could barely make out the shapes of trees, their trunks twisted and gnarled, rising out of the mist like skeletal fingers. A chill seeped into the room, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just the soft rustle of unseen movement in the fog. I knew I should have closed the door, locked it, and thrown the key as far away as I could. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped through. The ground was soft beneath my feet, a carpet of wet leaves and moss. The air was colder here, the fog clinging to my skin. I turned to look back, but the doorway was gone. My apartment wasn't there. Panic surged through me as I spun in place, searching for any sign of the door or anything familiar. But the fog was everywhere, thick and suffocating, distorting the shapes around me. And then I heard it, a whisper. It came from somewhere deep in the fog, faint and indistinct, like the sound of wind brushing through the trees. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing strangely. The whisper grew louder, clearer, as though whatever was speaking was drawing closer. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low and fractured, like it was breaking apart with every word. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and fell hard onto the damp ground. My hand scraped against something sharp, and when I looked down, I saw a piece of bone jutting out of the earth. Not just one. The ground around me was littered with them, small, splintered fragments, half buried in the moss. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, coming from all directions. "Go back. It's too late. It's watching." My heart thundered as I scrambled to my feet, spinning in circles, trying to find the source of the voices. That's when I saw the figure. It stood just beyond the edge of the fog, tall and thin, its silhouette sharp against the haze. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, but I knew it was looking at me. The whispers stopped all at once, leaving the air heavy with silence. Then, slowly, the figure raised a hand and pointed behind me. I turned, and there it was, the door. It was standing upright in the middle of the clearing, its black wood gleaming in the pale light. I didn't hesitate. I ran for it, throwing myself through the doorway and slamming it shut behind me. When I turned around, I was back in my apartment. The air was warm again, the fog and forest gone. But the key was still in my hand, and when I looked at it, I saw something new. The metal was darker now, tarnished, and the grooves of the key. Let's start a new story. I first saw the house while driving home from work, a detour forced by road construction. It sat alone at the end of a narrow gravel road, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Something about it caught my eye. An old, sprawling Victorian with peeling white paint, shuttered windows, and a wraparound porch that sagged under its own weight. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The for sale sign swung lazily in the breeze, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I slowed down to look. I wasn't in the market for a house. My apartment was fine, but something about the place tugged at me, a magnetic pull that made me stop the car and snap a quick picture on my phone. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The image lingered in my mind as I lay awake, the house standing silent and heavy under a dull, overcast sky. By morning, I convinced myself it was nothing, a passing curiosity, no different from a glance at an antique store window. But when I checked my phone, the photo wasn't there. Instead, I found a single sentence saved to my notes app, written in a font I didn't recognize. "Come see me." My first instinct was to laugh it off, even though it wasn't funny. I hadn't opened my notes app in weeks, let alone written something so bizarre. But as I stared at the words, a chill spread through me like cold water soaking into my skin. I told myself it was a glitch, a prank. I deleted the note and tried to forget about it. But when I got into my car later that day, my GPS, untouched, had already plotted a route to the gravel road. I didn't go. I turned off the car, walked back inside, and spent the rest of the afternoon convincing myself that everything had an explanation. Glitches, mistakes, coincidence. But the nagging pull was still there, a gnawing itch at the back of my mind. By the time the sun set, I knew I wasn't going to be able to resist. The road was darker than I remembered, the gravel crunching under my tires loud in the stillness. When the house came into view, it looked even more decrepit in the moonlight. The shutters hung crooked, and the porch steps were chipped and splintered. A few of the windows were cracked, the glass catching the faint glow of my headlights. I parked at the end of the driveway, unsure of what I was doing. The air was colder here, damp and heavy. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I pulled it out, the screen displayed a notification. Welcome. The sender was listed as no caller ID. I should have left right then. I should have turned around and never looked back. But something about the house called to me, an invisible thread pulling me forward. The gravel crunched under my feet as I approached the front steps. The closer I got, the stronger the sensation grew, a strange pressure in my chest, as if the house were watching me. The door wasn't locked. It swung open with a soft creak, revealing a dim, cavernous interior. Dust motes swirled in the air, illuminated by the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. The smell of damp wood and mildew was overpowering, but beneath it was something else, a faint, metallic tang that made my stomach twist. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The room was empty, but the walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its floral pattern warped and peeling. A staircase to my left spiraled upward into darkness, and a narrow hallway stretched ahead, disappearing into shadows. My phone buzzed again. I hesitated before looking at it. Upstairs. I swallowed hard, my breath shaky. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the staircase. Each step creaked loudly in the silence, the sound echoing through the empty house. The air grew colder as I climbed, and by the time I reached the second floor, my breath was visible in the dim light. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with closed doors. My phone buzzed once more, and I glanced down, half expecting another instruction. But it wasn't a message. It was a photo, a picture of me, taken from behind. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The staircase was empty, the first floor bathed in shadow. The only sound was the faint creak of the house settling, but it felt too deliberate, like the place was alive and breathing. One of the doors at the end of the hallway was ajar. A faint light spilled through the gap, flickering like a dying candle. Against every instinct, I moved toward it, my steps slow and hesitant. The room was small and empty, except for a single wooden chair in the center. The walls were bare, the floorboards scratched and warped. On the chair sat an object wrapped in cloth, small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. The light was coming from it, a faint, pulsing glow that didn't seem to have a source. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The cloth felt rough and damp, and as I unwrapped it, the glow intensified. Inside was a small, intricately carved box. It was old, the wood dark and worn, but the carvings were sharp and precise, spiraling in patterns that hurt to look at for too long. The light dimmed as I held the box, replaced by a deep vibration that resonated in my chest. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, almost suffocating, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard a voice. "You're home." The next thing I remember is waking up in my car, parked back in my driveway. The box was in the passenger seat, wrapped in the same damp cloth. I don't remember leaving the house or driving home, but the image of the room, the chair, the light, the carvings, was burned into my mind. Since that night, strange things have started happening. I wake up to find the box in different places, no matter where I hide it. My phone buzzes with messages I don't remember receiving, all saying the same thing. You belong to me. Last night, I woke up to find the carvings from the box etched into my bedroom walls, glowing faintly in the dark. I think the house let me leave, but I don't think I ever really left. Let's start a new story. I found it wedged in my mailbox between a stack of coupons and a water bill. It was simple, unassuming, just a glossy photo of a lighthouse on a rocky shore. No return address, no postage, just my name written in sharp, angular handwriting across the back. On the bottom half, there was a single sentence. "Wish you were here." It was odd, sure, but not threatening. I figured someone had sent it as a joke, or maybe it was a mistake. I tossed it on the kitchen counter and didn't think about it again until the second postcard arrived 2 days later. This one showed a dense forest, the kind where the trees are so thick and close together that the ground is in permanent shadow. The writing was the same, sharp and unmistakable. "You're getting closer." A chill ran down my spine. Closer to what? I stared at the postcard for a long time, the edges of the glossy paper biting into my fingers. Maybe someone was messing with me. A prank. I thought about calling a friend to laugh it off, but the truth was, I didn't know who could have sent it. I'd been living alone in the city for years. My friends were scattered across different time zones, busy with their own lives. By the time the third postcard arrived, I was on edge. This one depicted an empty road stretching into a bleak, gray horizon. The air looked cold, the kind of sharp, biting chill that seeps into your bones. Almost there, it was getting harder to pretend this wasn't meant for me. I searched the postcards for clues, printing marks, smudges, anything to trace them back to their source. But there was nothing. The photos were generic, the type you might find on the spinning rack of a gas station somewhere far away. The handwriting was precise, mechanical, like it had been etched with purpose. Then came the fourth postcard. This one wasn't glossy. It was old, faded, its edges worn as though it had passed through too many hands. The photo on the front showed a house, a 2-story, weathered structure with peeling paint and sagging shutters. It wasn't just any house. It was mine. "We're waiting." I dropped the postcard as though it had burned me, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was impossible. Whoever was sending these knew where I lived. They knew me. I locked every door and window, pacing the length of my apartment as I tried to make sense of it. Should I call someone? The police? And tell them what? That someone was sending me cryptic postcards? That night, I didn't sleep. The fifth postcard came the next morning. This time, I didn't find it in the mailbox. It was lying on my kitchen counter, neatly placed next to the stack of unopened bills. I knew for certain I hadn't put it there. The image was different this time. It was a close-up of my apartment door, taken from the hallway. Open the door. I backed away, the card trembling in my hand. My eyes flicked to the door, half expecting it to swing open. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it reverberated through me like a gunshot. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer. I crept closer to the door, every muscle in my body taut with fear. Pressing my eye to the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, and yet the knocking continued. 3 slow, deliberate taps, followed by silence. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the hallway stretched before me, empty and still. But lying on the floor just outside was another postcard. This one wasn't a photograph. It was a drawing, crudely sketched with rough pencil strokes. The image showed a figure sitting at a table, alone, staring out a window. I didn't need to flip it over to know what it said. "We're inside." I slammed the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands shook as I turned the locks again, though it felt like locking the door was a futile gesture. I checked the apartment, room by room, the closets, the bathroom, even under the bed. Nothing. No one. But as I stood in the living room, staring at the postcards scattered across the counter, I felt it. The air had changed. It was subtle at first, a faint pressure on my chest, the sense that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I turned slowly. The window. I'd left it closed, hadn't I? Now it was open, just a crack, letting in the cold night air. I stepped toward it, my pulse thundering in my ears. When I reached the window, I looked out into the street below. Everything was normal, except for the figure. It was standing across the street, barely visible in the shadow of a street lamp. Its shape was indistinct, as though it was made of smoke or fog. But its eyes, two pinpricks of white light, were unmistakable. It raised its hand and waved. I stumbled back, tripping over the corner of the coffee table. When I looked again, the street was empty. The postcards haven't stopped. Every day, they're waiting for me, each one more cryptic than the last. They've started to show places I've never been. Empty fields, dense woods, strange, featureless rooms. But one thing is always the same. They all say the same thing now. Come home. Let's start a new story. Camera at a thrift shop. Something about its weight in my hands, its slightly scuffed body, felt oddly compelling. It reminded me of family trips as a kid, the kind where my parents would snap pictures of the same sunset from 3 different angles and argue over which one was best. The guy behind the counter sold it to me for next to nothing. Nobody uses these anymore, he said with a shrug. Film's harder to find than gold. But tucked inside the camera was a surprise, a cartridge with a few shots left. It was impulsive, but I decided to take it home and try it out. The first few pictures were mundane. My cluttered desk, my half-dead houseplant, the fading daylight spilling through my apartment window. The Polaroids developed as you'd expect. Overexposed in places, slightly grainy, but charmingly retro. It was the last photo that changed everything. I was sitting on the couch, aiming the camera at nothing in particular, when I clicked the shutter. The mechanical whir of the film sliding out was satisfying, a relic of analog tech in a digital world. I set the photo down on the coffee table and waited for the image to develop, scrolling on my phone to kill time. When I picked up the photo a minute later, my heart skipped. It wasn't my apartment. The image was sharp, eerily so for an old Polaroid camera, but it didn't show the room I was sitting in. Instead, the photograph depicted a narrow hallway, its walls covered in peeling floral wallpaper. The floorboards were warped and dark, as though they'd been soaked in water and left to rot. At the end of the hallway was a door. It was slightly ajar, just enough to hint at the darkness beyond. I stared at the photo, my pulse quickening. My first thought was that the camera was broken, that it had somehow captured an image left behind from its previous owner. But that didn't make sense. The hallway didn't look familiar. It didn't look like anywhere near my apartment or anywhere I'd ever been. I set the photo down and told myself not to overthink it. Maybe it was some quirk of old film, a double exposure, something easily explained. But the hallway stuck in my mind. That night, I dreamed about it. In the dream, I was standing at the far end of the hallway, staring at the door. The wallpaper seemed to breathe, the patterns shifting in the dim light. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I walked forward, drawn to the sliver of darkness beyond the door. When I reached it, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and I felt something on the other side. Not a sound, not a movement, just a presence. I woke up before I could open it. The next day, I tried to forget about the photo. I tucked it into a drawer and resolved to go about my day as usual. But the drawer felt heavier, like the photograph was pressing against it, demanding my attention. By evening, I couldn't resist. I pulled the Polaroid out and stared at it again. The hallway looked the same, but something was different. The door was open wider. Not much, just an inch or two, but enough to see the black void beyond it. My hands trembled as I set the photo down. This couldn't be happening. Polaroids didn't change. Once the image developed, it was permanent. I decided to test the camera again. I aimed it at my kitchen, clicked the shutter, and waited. When the film developed, it showed my kitchen exactly as I'd expected. No strange hallways, no impossible images. Just the cluttered counters and mismatched plates I'd seen every day for years. I tried again, this time pointing the camera at my bedroom. Same result. My bedroom, untouched, ordinary. But when I picked up the original photo again, the door had opened wider. Now I could see the faint outline of something in the darkness. A shape, humanoid but wrong, its edges blurred and indistinct. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I shoved the photo back into the drawer and slammed it shut, determined to ignore it. But the house didn't feel the same anymore. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind rattling the windows made me jump. That night, I dreamed again. I was back in the hallway, but this time, the door was wide open. The void beyond it seemed alive, its darkness pulsing like a heartbeat. I tried to turn away, but my feet wouldn't move. Then, from the shadows, something stepped forward. I woke with a start, gasping for air. The drawer was open. The Polaroid lay on my nightstand, the hallway now entirely black. The door was gone. The wallpaper was gone. All that remained was an inky void that seemed to ripple, as if the photograph were struggling to contain it. And then the camera clicked. I hadn't touched it. It was sitting across the room, untouched since the night before. But the shutter word and a new photo slid out. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The photo developed quickly, faster than it should have. It was my apartment, only I wasn't in it. The photo showed my living room, empty except for the tall, blurred shape standing by the window. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the camera and the photos, shoved them into a bag, and drove to the nearest bridge. I hurled them into the river, watching as the bag sank beneath the dark water. When I got home, my apartment felt lighter. The air was clearer, the shadows less oppressive. But last night, when I was getting ready for bed, I saw it. A Polaroid lying face down on my nightstand. When I turned it over, my blood ran cold. It was me asleep in bed, and in the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows, was the door, wide open. Let's start a new story. Or walk up in a building that should have been condemned 20 years ago. The paint peeled, the plumbing groaned, and the whole place smelled faintly of mold. But it was cheap. That was enough for me. The landlord didn't mention the water stain on the ceiling when I signed the lease, but it was hard to miss. A sprawling, irregular patch of gray right above my bed. I told myself I'd get used to it, and for a while I did, until it started growing. At first, it was subtle. The edges darkened, creeping outward an inch at a time. I try not to think about it. Old buildings have leaks, right? Maybe it was from the apartment upstairs. Then I noticed it wasn't just the size, it was the shape. The stain didn't spread randomly. It grew in deliberate patterns, curling into arcs and spirals, forming shapes I didn't want to look at too closely. I called the landlord. Water damage, he said dismissively. Just need some patchwork. He promised to send someone to take a look. No one ever came. A week later, I woke up to find the stain had doubled in size. It now stretched across half the ceiling, the edges jagged like a frayed piece of cloth. I tried not to look at it as I brushed my teeth, but something about it kept drawing my eyes. That's when I realized it was moving. Not fast, just a faint shimmer at the edges, like heat waves rising off asphalt. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was still. I told myself I was imagining things. That night, I dreamed of water. I was drowning, my arms flailing against the weight of it, my chest burning as I tried to scream. But it wasn't just water. It was thick, black, and cold, dragging me deeper into nothingness. When I woke up, my room felt damp. The air was heavy, humid, like a storm was about to break. I looked up at the stain, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't just a stain anymore. It had depth now. The gray patch wasn't flat against the ceiling like it had been. It bulged slightly like something was pressing against it from the other side. I climbed onto my bed to get a closer look. The surface rippled faintly when I moved my hand near it. Not like paint or plaster, but like water. I didn't touch it. That afternoon, I heard the first sound. It started as a faint tapping, rhythmic and slow, coming from the ceiling. At first, I thought it was the upstairs neighbor, but when I went to knock on their door, no one answered. The tapping grew louder that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady, hollow knock. It sounded deliberate, like someone was counting time. And then it stopped. For a moment, the silence felt heavier than the noise had been. Then I heard the voice. Soft, low, almost a whisper. Come closer. I sat up, heart racing, my eyes locked on the bulging stain. It shimmered faintly in the moonlight, the ripples growing larger. The voice came again, more insistent this time. Come closer. I don't remember grabbing my keys or running down the stairs. All I know is that I didn't stop until I was standing on the sidewalk, gasping for air. I stayed with a friend that night. When I returned the next morning, the apartment felt wrong. The smell of damp had worsened, thick and choking. The air was colder, heavy with something I couldn't name. And the stain was enormous now, covering almost the entire ceiling. It pulsed faintly, like it was alive. I decided to leave for good. I packed what I could and called the landlord, telling him I was breaking the lease. He was annoyed, but I didn't care. "At least check the ceiling," I said before hanging up. But as I turned to grab my bag, something caught my eye. The stain was rippling again, the waves larger, more chaotic. And at the center, a shape was forming. It was faint at first, like an impression pressed into wet concrete. A hand. It pressed against the surface from the other side, the fingers long and spindly, dragging slowly across the rippling membrane. I couldn't move. Then a second hand appeared, clawing at the edges of the stain. The voice came again, louder now, echoing through the room. "Let me in." I don't remember running, but somehow I ended up outside, my bag forgotten in the hallway. I called the landlord one last time, telling him what I'd seen. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss me. He just sighed and said, "It's awake, isn't it?" Then he hung up. I didn't go back. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear it. A faint tapping, rhythmic and slow. And I wonder if it's still waiting for me to come closer. Let's start a new story. Thing I'd planned to do. I'd just been driving through a sleepy neighborhood one Saturday morning, nursing a coffee, when I spotted a woman setting up a small table on her lawn. It was the kind of sale where everything looked like it had been rescued from the back of a garage. Yellowed books, mismatched dishes, rusting tools. And then there was the radio. It was old, the kind you'd imagine sitting in a 1950s living room. The wooden casing was worn but polished, and its dials had a satisfying weight to them when I turned them. A little brass plate above the speaker read, "Here and Now." Something about it drew me in. "How much?" I asked, gesturing to the radio. The woman hesitated. "It doesn't work," she said quickly. "It's just for decoration." "That's fine," I replied. "How much?" She stared at me for a moment, like she wanted to say something else, then shrugged. $10. I paid her, loaded it into my car, and forgot about it until later that evening when I brought it inside. It fit perfectly on the corner table in my living room, giving the space a retro charm. I didn't think much about the fact that it started working the next night. It happened while I was reading on the couch. The soft crackle of static filled the room, faint at first, but unmistakable. I set my book down and turned toward the radio. The dials hadn't moved, but the brass plate seemed to gleam faintly, catching the light in a way I hadn't noticed before. Curious, I walked over and twisted the tuning dial. The static shifted, warbling, until a voice broke through. It was clear, steady, and unmistakably live. If you're just joining us, tonight's story is about choices. The ones we make and the ones we avoid. I froze. There was something intimate about the voice, like the speaker was addressing me directly. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to be standing behind me. "You've been avoiding something, haven't you?" The voice continued, its tone conversational but knowing. "A decision you don't want to make. But every choice has a consequence, whether you act or not." I didn't respond. The rational part of my brain told me this was some old radio program the device had inexplicably picked up. But there was something about the timing, something about the way it spoke, the way it knew. The voice paused, then added, almost gently, "Do you know what's waiting for you?" The static surged, swallowing the voice, and then the radio went silent. I didn't touch it again for a week, but the radio didn't care. The next time it turned on by itself, it was 3 a.m. The sound of a woman sobbing jolted me awake, the noise reverberating through the apartment. I stumbled into the living room, heart hammering, and found the radio glowing faintly. Her voice broke through the static, raw and trembling. I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't mean to. The sobbing grew louder, desperate, as though she were standing right there in the room with me. I slammed the dial to off, but the radio kept playing, her voice growing distorted, words dissolving into garbled cries. It wasn't until I yanked the cord from the wall that the sound finally stopped. I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I decided to throw the thing out. I carried it to the dumpster behind my building, dropped it in, and walked away without looking back. But that night, it was back. I found it sitting on the same corner table, polished and pristine, as though I'd never touched it. My stomach turned as I stared at it, the brass plate gleaming faintly in the dim light. The radio crackled to life. "You're trying to run," the voice said softly. "But you can't, you know. Not from this." I didn't answer. The voice chuckled, a low, mirthless sound. "You should listen closely. You might learn something." The static shifted, and a new voice emerged. A child's voice, high-pitched and hesitant. "I saw her, Mommy," the child said. "She was standing in my room. She said she's waiting for you." The static cut out abruptly, leaving the apartment silent. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. That voice, it wasn't random. It was mine, or at least it sounded exactly like me as a child. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the woman who'd sold me the radio. I found her number in a crumpled flyer I'd grabbed from the yard sale. "Hello," she answered, her voice wary. "It's about the radio," I said. There was a long pause. "You shouldn't have taken it," she said finally, her tone flat. "What is it?" I demanded. Another pause. Then, "It doesn't broadcast. It reflects." "Reflects what?" "Everything you've ignored. Everything you've buried." Her voice cracked. "It's not just a radio. It's a window. And some things on the other side, they don't like being forgotten." The line went dead. That night, the radio spoke again. "Do you remember her?" the voice asked. It wasn't my voice, or the child's voice, or even the man's from the first night. It was something new, something hollow. "She remembers you," it continued, almost teasing. "And she's here now." I turned slowly, every instinct screaming at me not to look. And there she was. A figure stood in the corner of the room, half shrouded in shadow. Her features were indistinct, blurred, but her eyes burned with something raw, something accusing. "You left me," she whispered, her voice low and cracking. "Do you remember?" The memories hit me like a wave, memories I'd locked away, ignored, buried. A face I hadn't thought of in years. A promise I'd broken. "I'm sorry." I choked out, my throat dry. Her head tilted, her eyes narrowing. "Too late," she said. The radio crackled violently, the sound rising into a deafening roar. The last thing I heard was her voice, clear and cold. "You should have listened." When I woke up, the radio was gone, but the voices stayed. Let's start a new story. Wasn't right. It had always been there, a frosted square overlooking the alley, but that night it seemed taller, narrower. The edges of the frame were uneven, like it had been hastily replaced. I stared at it, toothbrush frozen mid-motion, wondering how I'd never noticed it before. The alley beyond was still dark and empty, but the frost on the glass seemed thicker, swirling slightly as if something on the other side was moving, trying to press closer. I shook my head and spat out the toothpaste. "It's just your imagination," I muttered, turning off the light. The window wasn't there the next morning. Instead, the wall was seamless, smooth plaster, as if a window had never existed. I stared at it for a full 5 minutes, feeling the weight of my confusion pressing down on me. I even ran my hands over the wall, searching for some seam or trace of the frame. There was nothing. My head throbbed with the effort of trying to remember, of convincing myself it had been there in the first place. I chalked it up to stress, a trick of memory. I was overdue for a day off. Anyway, but things kept shifting. Subtle at first, the couch moved an inch to the left. A stack of books rearranged themselves on the shelf. A crack in the kitchen tile disappeared overnight. I didn't say anything to anyone because, really, who would believe me? I wasn't sure I believed me. The problem wasn't just that things were different. It was that they felt wrong, unnatural, as if the apartment itself were trying to fix something I hadn't asked it to fix. It wasn't until the second week that I began to hear it. A faint scratching noise, like nails dragged lightly across drywall. It started at night, always coming from the same spot, the corner of my bedroom. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, enough to pull me out of whatever fragile sleep I managed. I checked for mice, for bugs, for anything that might explain the noise. There was nothing there, not even a hole in the wall. Just the faint scent of dust and plaster. The scratching got worse. I tried ignoring it. Earplugs, white noise, music, none of it worked. It didn't stop, not even when I banged my fist against the wall or shouted into the empty room. If anything, it grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making the sound knew I was trying to drown it out. The wall where the scratching came from started to change, too. The paint bubbled slightly, just in that corner, a subtle distortion I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't spent so many sleepless nights staring at it. By the third week, a faint outline appeared, something angular and uneven, barely visible under the surface. The dreams began not long after. They weren't normal dreams. In them, I was always in my apartment, but it wasn't my apartment. The walls were wrong, too close together, leaning inward like they were collapsing. The furniture was all in the same places, but twisted, warped versions of itself. My bookshelf stretched to the ceiling, the books too large, their spines blank. The lights buzzed and flickered, but I could never find the switch. And in every dream, the wall in the corner was open. Not a hole exactly, but a gap, a space that shouldn't have been there. Beyond it was something, shadows that writhed and twisted without a source. A deep, low sound, almost like breathing, but slow and uneven, as if whatever was making it wasn't used to lungs. Something was watching me from the gap. Every time I woke up, drenched in sweat, I would check the corner. It was still there, unchanged except for that faint outline growing clearer, pushing against the surface like something straining to be let out. I tried leaving once, packed a bag, booked a motel across town, and drove there with the intent of staying at least a week. But I didn't even make it through the first night. The scratching followed me, faint at first, coming from the motel's thin walls. By midnight, it was so loud I could feel it vibrating through the bed frame. When I came back to the apartment, the corner was worse. Now the outline was unmistakable, a shape pressing outward, jagged and wrong. It wasn't a door, not exactly. It was uneven, too organic, like something had clawed at the walls from the other side and left its mark. The scratching was louder than ever, relentless, accompanied by a faint vibration that rippled through the room. I swore I could see the edges of the wall shiver when the sound grew particularly intense. And the dreams became harder to escape. In them, I wasn't just watching the gap. I was walking toward it, my feet dragged across the floor, my arms hanging uselessly at my sides. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't stop. The gap grew larger with every step, the shadows spilling out like smoke, swallowing the room. Something waited for me inside. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was smiling. I woke up last night to find the wall cracked. Not fully open, not yet, but splintered enough to reveal a sliver of blackness beyond. The air around it was cold, thick with the scent of damp earth and rust. The scratching had stopped. Now it's knocking. It's slow, deliberate, each knock vibrating through my chest like a second heartbeat. I don't know what it wants, but I know it's coming through soon. The cracks are growing wider, and the air feels heavier, as if the apartment is holding its breath. I tried boarding it up, covering it with furniture, but no matter what I do, the gap stays. I can feel it watching me now, not just in the dreams, but here, in the waking world. It's close. So close. The knocking has stopped again. I wish it hadn't. The silence is worse. I think it's waiting for me to open it. And I think somehow it knows I will. Let's start a new story. I was in my office, staring at the glowing spreadsheet on my monitor, when I reached for my coffee cup. My desk wasn't messy, just a laptop, a notepad, and a framed photo of me and my brother on a fishing trip last summer. But as my fingers closed around the handle of the mug, something felt off. The coffee was hot. I hadn't taken a sip in hours. I set it back down, staring at the steam curling lazily into the air. For a moment, I thought maybe someone had swapped it out as a kind gesture, but no one ever came to my desk. I picked it up again, and the heat pressed into my palm like a warning. I didn't drink it. The next day, things got stranger. As I stepped out of the elevator onto my floor, I passed a woman I didn't recognize. That wasn't unusual. I worked in a big building full of people I'd probably never meet. But when she brushed past me, she whispered something. "You're slipping." The words were soft, almost drowned out by the ding of the elevator doors closing behind me. I turned to look at her, but she was already gone, lost in the crowd of suits and heels. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus, but my head felt heavy, like it was stuffed with cotton. Every so often, I glanced at the coffee cup on my desk, which I hadn't touched since the day before. By lunchtime, it was steaming again. That night, I walked home instead of taking the subway, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The city was alive with its usual chaos. Horns blaring, neon signs flickering, the hum of 1,000 overlapping conversations. But as I turned the corner onto my street, the noise stopped. It wasn't gradual. One moment, the city was loud and chaotic, and the next it was silent. I stood in the middle of the sidewalk, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The streetlights were still on, but their glow felt wrong, too bright, casting sharp shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally. And then I saw him. A man was standing at the end of the block, dressed in a dark suit, his hands clasped in front of him. His face was turned away, but something about him felt familiar, like I should know who he was. "Hey!" I called out, my voice too loud in the eerie quiet. He didn't move. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. When I was halfway down the block, he turned to face me. It was me, not someone who looked like me. It was me. Same face, same tired eyes, same neatly trimmed beard. But his expression was different, calm, almost serene, as if he knew something I didn't. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "What?" I stammered. "You weren't supposed to notice." The streetlights flickered, and when they steadied, he was gone. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I woke up to find my coffee cup already steaming on the counter. The changes came faster after that. At work, my coworkers called me by the wrong name, Daniel instead of Matt. The framed photo on my desk showed me alone, no brother in sight. Even my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked slightly off, like the version of me I'd seen on the street. One night, I got home to find my apartment door unlocked. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender, though I never used air freshener. My kitchen table was set for two, and a plate of food sat waiting for me, steaming hot, even though I'd been gone all day. "Who's here?" I called out, my voice shaking. No one answered, but I heard faint footsteps behind me. When I turned around, the door to my bedroom was open. It hadn't been open when I came in. I crept toward it, my heart pounding. The hallway beyond was dark, impossibly so, like the light had been sucked out. I hesitated, then reached for the switch. The moment the light came on, I saw him again. The other me. He stood at the end of the hallway, his face partially obscured by shadow. "You have to stop," he said, his voice low and calm. "Stop what?" "Noticing." "I don't understand," I said, stepping back. He tilted his head, the corner of his mouth curling into a faint smile. "You will." The lights flickered, and when they steadied, he was gone. That night, I dreamt of a room. It was vast and empty, its walls lined with mirrors that stretched endlessly in every direction. In each mirror, I saw a different version of myself, some older, some younger, some with scars I didn't recognize. At the center of the room was a door. It was tall and black, its surface polished to a mirror-like finish. The brass handle gleamed in the dim light, inviting me to turn it. I reached for the handle, but before I could open the door, one of the reflections moved. It wasn't in sync with me anymore. The other me smiled, stepping closer to the glass. "You're almost ready," he whispered. I woke with a start, the sound of his voice echoing in my head. The coffee cup was steaming on my nightstand, and now every time I close my eyes, I see the door. I'm afraid of what will happen when I finally open it. Let's start a new story. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of drab, forgettable day you never expect to matter. I had just moved into a new apartment after a brutal breakup and a cross-country relocation. The place wasn't much, barely 600 square feet, outdated appliances, and an inexplicably loud radiator. But it was mine. Cheap and temporary. A fresh start. The building was old, the kind of place with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper that no amount of paint could disguise. My neighbor across the hall, an elderly woman named Mrs. Drummond, had introduced herself on my first day, handing me a plate of stale cookies and a piece of unsolicited advice. "Don't bother the door at the end of the hallway," she said, her eyes sharp despite her frail appearance. "It doesn't like to be disturbed." I assumed it was a weird joke, a quirky old lady thing. I laughed it off, thanked her for the cookies, and went back to unpacking. The door in question was nothing special, plain and unmarked, tucked at the far end of the hallway next to a storage closet. It didn't even have a number. Probably just a maintenance room, I figured, and promptly forgot about it. For a while, life in the new apartment was uneventful. I worked long hours at a dead-end job, came home, and spent my evenings scrolling on my phone or binge-watching old sitcoms. The hallway was usually quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than it should, like the walls were holding secrets. Every now and then, I'd catch Mrs. Drummond shuffling in or out of her apartment, her gaze always darting toward the door at the end of the hall before she hurried away. The first time I noticed something strange, it was late at night. I'd been lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it, a soft scratching sound, faint but deliberate. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest, and listened. The noise was coming from the hallway. Rationalizing it as a mouse or the pipes acting up, I tried to go back to sleep. But the scratching didn't stop. It continued for hours, slow and rhythmic, like nails dragging against wood. When morning came, I checked the hallway, but it was empty. The door at the end of the hall was closed, as unremarkable as ever. The next few nights, the scratching grew louder. Sometimes it was accompanied by a faint tapping, like someone knocking gently, almost politely. It always stopped by morning, leaving no evidence that anything had happened. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings make weird noises, right? But then I started seeing it. It began as a shadow, not the usual play of light and darkness from the street lamps outside, but something darker, thicker, moving just at the edge of my vision. I'd catch glimpses of it when I walked past the hallway at night, a flicker of motion near the door at the end of the hall. Whenever I looked directly at it, it was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stress of the move and the breakup was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew better. The door was wrong. One night, the noises woke me again, louder this time. Scratching, tapping, and something else, something like a low, guttural hum, almost like a voice, but not quite. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight and my phone, I stepped into the hallway. The air felt different out there. Heavy, stagnant, like stepping into a room that hadn't been opened in years. The sounds grew louder as I approached the door, and for the first time, I noticed the faint marks on its surface. Scratch marks. Long, deep gouges that crisscrossed the wood like something had been clawing at it. I should have turned around. I should have gone back to bed and pretended I hadn't seen anything. But instead, I reached for the doorknob. It was cold, colder than it should have been. My fingers hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stop, but curiosity pushed me forward. I turned the knob, expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. A void, endless and black, stretching out in front of me. My flashlight should have cut through it, but the beam disappeared as if the darkness swallowed it whole. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, barely distinguishable from the blackness around it. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was moving, crawling, a figure twisted and grotesque, dragging itself toward me on two long limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face, if you could call it that, was a writhing mass of pale, featureless flesh, except for a single slit of a mouth that stretched too wide. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat, but my legs felt heavy, like the air itself was pushing against me. The figure crawled closer, its head tilting in an unnatural jerk, and from the slit in its face, a voice emerged. "Why did you open it?" The words weren't loud, but they cut through the air like a blade. I turned and ran, slamming the door shut behind me and sprinting back to my apartment. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely lock the door. The next morning, Mrs. Drummond was gone. Her apartment was empty, her door slightly ajar. The hallway felt different, lighter somehow, like the building had exhaled. I asked the landlord about her, but he just gave me a confused look. "There's no one in that apartment," he said. "Hasn't been for years." I left that same day, packed my things, and drove across town to stay with a friend, leaving the keys in the mailbox without saying goodbye. I didn't care about the deposit or the lease. I just needed to get out. But sometimes late at night, I hear it again, scratching, tapping, and that low, guttural hum. And I know the door hasn't forgotten me. Let's start a new story. Before. It was in the basement of my new house, a single, unremarkable door tucked into the corner of the laundry room. I only saw it because the dryer buzzed, and I had to shuffle into that shadowy corner to reach the switch. There it was, half hidden behind a stack of old paint cans left by the previous owner. I stared at it for a moment, puzzled. It didn't match the rest of the house. The other doors were standard, hollow core, painted white. This one was dark, solid wood, with a strange, knotted grain that almost seemed to shift when I looked at it too long. I tried the handle. Locked. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just a closet I didn't have a key for. The house was old, after all. It had quirks, but something about that door stuck in my mind. The next day, I moved the paint cans aside and examined it more closely. There was no lock I could see, no keyhole, just a tarnished brass handle that felt oddly warm under my hand. When I pressed my ear to it, I heard something faint, a low, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat muffled by layers of wood and stone. I stepped back quickly, my pulse racing. That night, I dreamed of the door. In the dream, it wasn't locked. I opened it to find a staircase spiraling downward, the steps carved from rough stone, slick with something wet. The air was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that turned my stomach. As I descended, the heartbeat grew louder, reverberating through the walls and into my chest. At the bottom of the stairs was another door, this one larger, ancient, and covered in carvings I couldn't understand. The heartbeat came from behind it, so loud it made the ground tremble. I reached out to touch the door, and the moment my fingers brushed the surface, I woke up. The dream should have faded, but it didn't. The details lingered, sharp and vivid, as if I'd actually been there. By the third night, I couldn't stop thinking about the door in the basement. It felt like it was pulling at me, a weight at the edge of my consciousness that I couldn't shake. I decided to try opening it again. I brought a screwdriver, a crowbar, anything I could think of to force it open. But when I turned the handle, it swung inward with a creak, as though it had been unlocked the whole time. Beyond the door was exactly what I'd seen in the dream. A staircase spiraling downward, carved from rough stone. I stood there for a long moment, my breath shallow, the cold air from the stairwell seeping into the room. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a basement, a second level, maybe a storm shelter I hadn't known about when I bought the house. Houses this old always had odd features. I took a step down, then another. The stone was slick under my shoes, and the deeper I went, the colder the air became. The metallic smell from the dream was there too, faint but unmistakable. The staircase seemed impossibly long, spiraling deeper and deeper into the earth. I tried counting the steps to calm myself, but I lost track somewhere after 100. Finally, I reached the bottom. The second door was there, just like in the dream. It was massive, easily twice my height, and covered in strange carvings, symbols and shapes that made my head ache to look at. The heartbeat was louder now, pounding against my chest in a way that felt almost alive. I didn't want to touch the door. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to run back up the stairs and forget I'd ever found this place. But I couldn't leave. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the carvings. The moment I made contact, the door shuddered, the carvings shifting under my touch like they were alive. The heartbeat stopped. The silence was worse. Then slowly, the door began to open. What lay beyond was darkness, thick, impenetrable, alive. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something deeper, something that seemed to pulse and breathe, its edges curling like smoke. From within the darkness, something moved. It stepped forward, just enough for me to see its outline. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong. Too many limbs, too many angles, its body shifting like it couldn't decide what form to take. I couldn't move. It leaned closer, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. "You opened the door," it said, its voice like the grinding of stone. I stumbled back, the words catching in my throat. I didn't mean to, I stammered. Its shape twisted, folding and unfolding in ways that made my stomach churn. "What do you seek?" it asked. I don't know," I whispered. It tilted its head, the movement unnervingly fluid. "You brought me here," it said, the words echoing in my mind. "Now I will stay." The darkness surged forward, and the next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor of my basement, staring up at the ceiling. The door was gone. Not just the second door, the first one too. The corner of the room where it had been was now nothing but blank concrete. I told myself it was over. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the heartbeat. Faint, but growing louder. Let's start a new story. Free. Quiet countryside cabin, utilities included. Must stay full-time. No visitors. The post didn't have much else. Just a grainy photo of a small, weathered cabin surrounded by trees, with an email address at the bottom. I scrolled past it at first, but I kept coming back. I'd just been evicted, had no job prospects, and my savings were nearly gone. Free rent, even in the middle of nowhere, sounded like salvation. I sent a quick email, more out of desperation than hope. Less than an hour later, I got a response. The message was short and to the point. "Cabin's yours if you want it. Follow these rules. Stay inside after dark. Do not look out the windows. Do not respond to voices you hear at night. Reply if you agree." Most people would have noped out right there. But I wasn't most people. I was broke and desperate. Rules or not, free rent was free rent. I replied that I agreed, packed what little I had, and drove out the next day. The cabin was smaller than I expected, just one room with a bed, a table, and a wood stove. The forest around it was dense, the kind of place where sunlight barely made it through the canopy. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and barely any reception on the radio. It felt like stepping into another time, another world. On the table, I found a handwritten note. "Welcome. Rules are taped to the wall. Stick to them, and you'll be fine. Good luck." The rules were written in the same blocky handwriting as the email, each one underlined for emphasis. 1. Stay inside after dark. 2. Do not look out the windows. 3. Do not respond to voices you hear at night. 4. Do not leave the cabin until sunrise, no matter what you hear. 5. Never open the trapdoor. The last rule gave me pause. I hadn't even noticed the trapdoor yet, but there it was, in the center of the cabin floor, small and square, with heavy iron hinges and no handle. My stomach tightened as I read the list again, the reality of my situation sinking in. I told myself the rules were just some quirky tradition or a scare tactic to keep strangers from trashing the place. The first night, I followed the rules without question. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat in bed, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Nothing happened. No voices, no extraño noises. Just silence. By the second night, I was starting to feel foolish. The cabin was eerie, sure, but the rules seemed unnecessary, almost ridiculous. I still followed them, though. No reason to tempt fate. On the third night, the voices started. I was lying in bed, staring at the cracked wooden ceiling, when I heard it, a faint knock on the window. My heart skipped. Then came the voice, soft, familiar. "Hey, it's me. Open up." It sounded like my sister, but I knew it wasn't her. She was 200 miles away, and she didn't even know I was here. "Come on," the voice said, coaxing. "It's cold out here. Just let me in." I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands gripping the blanket. The rules were clear. Do not respond to voices. The knocking continued, steady and insistent, followed by more voices. My sisters, my old bosses, even my ex-boyfriends, each one pleading, coaxing, their tones shifting from warm to desperate to angry. "Open the door, you selfish prick." One of them screamed, slamming the window so hard I thought it would break. But I didn't move. The noise stopped just before dawn, And when I finally opened the curtains, the glass was clean, no sign anyone had been there. The fourth night was worse. This time, the voices didn't wait outside. They were inside the cabin, whispering in the corners behind the stove, under the bed. "It's your fault, you know," one hissed. It sounded like my mother, who died years ago. "You ruined everything. You always do." Another voice chimed in, closer this time. "Why don't you open the trapdoor? Don't you want to know what's down there?" I shoved the pillow over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were everywhere, growing louder, overlapping into a chorus of accusations and demands. By the fifth night, I was barely holding it together. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten much, and every creak of the cabin made me jump. The trapdoor loomed in the center of the room, its presence oppressive. I avoided looking at it, but it was always there, like it was waiting for me. That night, the knocking started again, louder this time, coming from all sides. The voices outside were shouting now, pounding on the windows and the door. Inside, the whispers returned, sharper and more insistent. "You have to open it. You can't ignore it forever." And then, for the first time, I heard something from beneath the trapdoor. It was faint, but unmistakable, a low, guttural sound, almost like breathing. My stomach churned as the wood beneath my feet vibrated, the noise growing louder. "Let me out," the voice said, deep and guttural, nothing like the others. "I've been waiting for you." I stayed in bed, gripping the edges of the mattress, willing myself not to move. But the air felt heavy, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The room seemed darker now, the corners swallowing the weak light from the lamp. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke, the cabin was silent again. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the curtains, and the voices were gone. But the trapdoor was open. The floor around it was splintered, the iron hinges twisted, as if something had forced its way out. My pulse raced as I approached it, peering into the darkness below. The space was shallow, no more than a crawl space, but it was empty. And then I saw the footprints. They led from the trapdoor to the door of the cabin, muddy and inhuman, with long, narrow toes that ended in sharp points. The door was still locked, the bolt in place, but the footprints ended right in front of it, as if whatever had come out had simply disappeared. I packed my things and left that same day. I didn't bother cleaning, didn't leave a note. I just drove until the cabin and the woods were far behind me. But now, even in my tiny apartment miles away, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't leave it behind. At night, I hear faint knocking on my windows, even though I'm 3 stories up. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the voices again. And last night, I noticed something on my floor. Footprints, leading from the window to my bed. Let's start a new story. It started with the smell. Not a bad smell. Exactly, more like the faint, sweet scent of something familiar, just on the edge of recognition. I noticed it one evening while sitting in my living room, the warm glow of the TV spilling across the room. At first, I thought it might be my neighbors cooking something, but it lingered, too persistent and too personal. I sniffed the air again, trying to place it. Lavender, maybe? No, something richer. Vanilla? Closer, but still not right. And then it hit me. It smelled like my grandmother's house. That warm, comforting blend of old wood, baking spices, and a hint of the lavender soap she kept by the sink. The realization made my stomach drop, because my grandmother had been gone for years, and the house she'd lived in had been sold to strangers long ago. I stood up, heart thudding, and checked the apartment. Everything looked normal. The doors locked, the windows shut. I even checked the vents, thinking maybe a candle or air freshener from a neighbor's place had somehow seeped through. But nothing explained it. By the time I went to bed, the smell had faded. But it came back the next night. This time, it was stronger, unmistakable. It didn't just hang in the air. It seemed to move, circling me as I sat on the couch. I felt a faint chill, like someone had cracked open a window behind me, though the night was still and my apartment airtight. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just some weird sensory memory triggered by stress. But the more I ignored it, the heavier the scent became, clinging to my clothes, my hair, even my skin. And then the dream started. In the first dream, I was back in my grandmother's house. The furniture was arranged exactly as I remembered. Her floral print armchair, the crocheted doilies on every flat surface, the dusty shelves lined with old books and knickknacks. But the house was empty, not just of people, of sound, of warmth, of life. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I wandered from room to room, calling out, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the silence. When I reached the kitchen, I froze. The table was set for two. Plates, silverware, glasses of water, and 2 steaming bowls of tomato soup, just like the kind my grandmother used to make. Except I hadn't seen her make it. "Sit," a voice said. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice came again, soft and familiar. "See." I woke up drenched in sweat, the faint scent of tomato soup lingering in the air. The next morning, I noticed something else. The photograph on my bedside table, the one of me and my grandmother from when I was 8, had changed. It was subtle, something I might not have noticed if I wasn't looking closely. But her smile was different. It was wider, too wide. Her eyes, too, seemed sharper, more focused. I tried to shake it off, but by the end of the day, I couldn't even look at the photo without a prickling sensation crawling up my spine. That night, I locked the photo in a drawer. The dreams got worse. Every night, I returned to my grandmother's house, but the rooms were darker now, the furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the scent, stronger, almost suffocating. "Sit," the voice said again, but this time it was different. It wasn't my grandmother's voice anymore. It was deeper, raspier, layered with something else, something that didn't feel human. When I woke up, I found a fresh bowl of tomato soup on my kitchen counter. I stared at it, unable to move. The soup was warm, the steam curling faintly into the air. The spoon was already in the bowl. I threw it out, bowl and all, and spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was losing my mind. But when I came home that evening, the smell was back, stronger than ever. It filled every corner of the apartment, clinging to the walls and seeping into my clothes. And on my dining table was another bowl of soup. This time there was a note next to it. See, the handwriting was mine. I left the apartment that night, driving aimlessly for hours, unsure of where to go. When I finally returned, exhausted and hoping it was over, I found the door to my apartment standing wide open. Inside, the air was thick, heavy, vibrating faintly with an energy I could feel in my teeth. The lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch too far, bending at impossible angles. And in the center of the living room, there was a chair. It wasn't mine. It was my grandmother's, a tall, worn armchair with faded floral upholstery, the same one she used to sit in by the window to knit. I knew it couldn't be real. The chair had been sold with the house years ago. But there it was, solid and tangible, with another bowl of soup waiting on a tray beside it. The note was there, too, resting on the armrest. See, I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was too tired to fight, or maybe it was the pull of something I couldn't understand. You said, the moment I did, the air shifted. The lights dimmed, the shadows deepened, and the faint hum in the air grew into a low, resonant vibration. And then I felt it. Hands, warm and familiar, resting on my shoulders. "Good," the voice said, right next to my ear. I couldn't move. The hands gripped tighter, their warmth fading into a sharp, icy cold. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, the chair was gone. But the smell remains. No matter how many windows I open, how many candles I burn, it won't go away. It follows me everywhere now, clinging to me like a second skin. And every night, I hear the voice. See, it's closer now. Let's start a new story. The first time I saw the message, it was written in condensation on my bathroom mirror. "You left the door open." I stared at it for a long moment, blinking through the steam from my shower, trying to convince myself I'd written it absent-mindedly. Maybe while brushing my teeth, but I didn't recognize the handwriting. The letters were slanted, sharp, almost hurried, and the way the words dripped down the mirror gave me an unshakable sense of urgency. I wiped it away with a towel and tried not to think about it. Later that night, as I lay in bed scrolling mindlessly on my phone, the words crept back into my mind. "You left the door open." "What door?" I checked all the locks before bed like I always did, front door, balcony, even the windows. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I got up to double check. Every lock was still in place. I even tugged at the front door to make sure it wouldn't budge. Satisfied, I went back to bed, though it took me a long time to drift off. The next day it was worse. I just returned from work, exhausted and craving nothing but quiet, when I noticed a message again. This time it was on the inside of my refrigerator door, written in something sticky and brown that looked like coffee but smelled faintly metallic. You left the door open. My pulse spiked. I hadn't written it. I hadn't even opened the fridge since that morning. I stood there frozen, the fridge door hanging open, the hum of its motor filling the silence. A part of me wanted to grab a sponge and erase the words, pretend I hadn't seen them. But I couldn't bring myself to touch them. Instead, I slammed the door shut and grabbed takeout for dinner, avoiding the kitchen for the rest of the night. That night, as I sat in the living room watching TV with the volume turned up too loud, something felt off. It was subtle at first, just a faint prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced at the window, the door, even behind the couch, but nothing was there. Then I noticed it, the faintest sound, almost imperceptible. A low creak like wood shifting under weight. It came from the direction of the hallway leading to my bedroom. My blood ran cold. I muted the TV and strained to listen. Silence. For a long moment, I just sat there, clutching the remote like a weapon. Then, slowly, I got up and walked toward the hallway. The air grew colder as I approached, unnaturally so, and the light in the hall seemed dimmer than it should have been. I reached the bedroom door and hesitated. It was open, not by much, just a crack, but I knew I'd left it closed. My hand shook as I pushed it open the rest of the way. The room was empty. The window was shut, the closet door closed, everything exactly where it should be. Except for one thing. On the bed, my blanket had been folded into a neat rectangle, and on top of it sat a key. The key was old, heavy, its surface worn smooth as if it had been handled countless times. I picked it up carefully, my fingers trembling. It felt unnaturally cold, almost like it had been sitting in ice water. I didn't recognize it. It didn't match any of the locks in my apartment. There was no note, no explanation, just the key and the quiet, which now felt oppressive. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, clutching the key and staring at the front door. Around 3 a.m., I started hearing the sound again, the creak of wood shifting. It was coming from the hallway, growing louder, closer, until it stopped just outside the living room. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw the bedroom door swing shut on its own. The next morning, I called the building manager. I told him there might be a problem with the locks, that someone might have gotten into my apartment. He came by with a tired expression and a jangling set of keys. But after checking everything, he found nothing out of place. "Locks are fine," he said, shrugging. "Doors don't just open and close themselves, you know." I wanted to argue, but I could see he didn't believe me. That evening, the message returned. This time, it was scrawled across the inside of my bedroom window, written in what looked like ash. "You left the door open." The key was lying next to it on the windowsill, even though I was sure I'd left it in the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I wiped the ash away and shoved the key into the back of a drawer. By the 5th day, I was barely functioning. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten much, and every sound in the apartment made me jump. The messages started appearing more frequently, on the bathroom tiles, inside kitchen cabinets, even on my computer screen. Always the same words: "You left the door open." And then on the 6th day, the messages changed. They stopped warning me. Now they asked, "Why did you leave it open?" That night, the creaking started again, but it wasn't coming from the hallway this time. It was inside the apartment, just beyond the living room, where the kitchen should have been. I stayed frozen in my chair, clutching my phone, staring into the darkened doorway. Slowly, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, until it became unmistakable. Footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of my phone. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to steady my shaking hands. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the doorway. Tall, too tall, its form shadowy and wrong. I couldn't make out any features, but its head tilted slowly to the side, as if studying me. In its hand, it held something small and metallic. A key. "You left the door open," it said, its voice a guttural whisper that seemed to echo in my skull. Before I could scream, it stepped forward, and the darkness swallowed everything. When I woke up, I was sitting on the floor of my living room, the lights back on, the apartment silent. The key was gone, and so was the figure. But when I turned toward the front door, I saw it. The door was wide open. Let's start a new story. The first letter came on a Tuesday. It was tucked under my windshield wiper when I left work, a plain white envelope with no markings except my name scrawled across the front in shaky black ink. James Klein. No address, no stamp. Just my name. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a note from someone who'd meant to leave it on someone else's car. But when I opened it, the paper inside made my stomach tighten. The note read, "You forgot about me. No signature." I stared at it for a long moment, confused and slightly unnerved. Who was it from? What did they mean? I looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the rows of cars were empty. I shoved the letter into my bag and drove home, convincing myself it was nothing. A prank, maybe, or a case of mistaken identity. But deep down, it felt personal. The second letter arrived 2 days later. This time, it was slipped under my apartment door. The same plain envelope, the same shaky handwriting. But this note was different. "You left me there." I felt a chill creep up my spine. Left them where? I called my sister that night, hoping for some reassurance. "Do you think someone's messing with me?" I asked, pacing the living room. "Maybe," she said hesitantly. "But it could just be a coincidence. You know, someone trying to reach the wrong James Klein. There's probably more than one in the city." I wanted to believe her, but the unease gnawed at me. Something about the letters felt deliberate, pointed, like they were meant for me and me alone. The third letter shattered any doubt. It came on Sunday, tucked into my mailbox. This one wasn't written in shaky ink. It was printed, like it had been typed on an old machine, the letters faint in some places and bold in others. "The woods. Do you remember the woods?" My mouth went dry. I hadn't thought about the woods in years. Not since I was 13, when my best friend Will and I used to sneak out there to build forts and tell ghost stories. The woods were our sanctuary, our escape from the boredom of small-town life. And then Will disappeared. It happened on a gray October afternoon. We were playing hide-and-seek near the old quarry, our favorite spot deep in the woods. Will had been counting, and I'd run ahead, ducking behind a cluster of boulders. I waited for him to find me, but he never did. When I came out, he was gone. The search lasted weeks, but no one ever found him. The police said he must have fallen into the quarry or wandered too far and gotten lost. But I knew better. I knew he'd been right behind me one moment, and then he wasn't. I spent years trying to forget. And now, the letters were dredging it all back up. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the wind outside, the faint rustling of tree branches. The words from the last letter echoed in my mind. The woods. Do you remember the woods? By morning, I made up my mind. I had to go back. I drove to the edge of town, where the woods still loomed like a dark green wall. It had been nearly 2 decades since I'd last set foot there, but the moment I stepped into the trees, the memories came flooding back. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of moss and earth. The light barely filtered through the dense canopy, casting everything in muted shades of gray and green. The path to the quarry was overgrown, but I found it easily enough. My feet seemed to know the way, even after all these years. When I reached the quarry, I stopped. The place looked smaller than I remembered, the cliffs less imposing, the rocks less sharp. But the unease I felt as a kid came rushing back. The feeling that the woods were alive, watching. I stood at the edge of the quarry, my heart pounding. "Well," I called, my voice shaky. No response. I took a step closer to the edge, peering down into the pit below. The water was dark and still, reflecting the sky like a sheet of glass. And then I saw it. Something moved beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was just the ripple of the wind. But as I stared, the shape grew clearer. A figure, pale and distorted, rising slowly from the depths. It was Will, or at least it looked like him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and dark, his hair plastered to his skull. His clothes were the same ones he'd been wearing the day he disappeared, tattered and clinging to his thin frame. But there was something wrong. His mouth didn't move, but I heard him speak. His voice was low and hollow, like it was coming from inside my head. "You left me." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Will, what happened to you? You left me here." "No," I shouted, the words tumbling out. I looked for you. Everyone did. We didn't know where you went." His head tilted a slow, unnatural movement. The corners of his mouth pulled upward into a grin that stretched too wide. "You forgot me." The water rippled violently, and before I could move, something shot out of the quarry. A hand, pale, wet, impossibly cold, clamped around my ankle, yanking me off balance. I hit the ground hard, my head snapping back against the dirt. I scrambled, kicking and clawing, but the grip was unrelenting, dragging me closer to the edge. My fingers dug into the soil, tearing at roots and rocks, but it wasn't enough. Just as I felt myself slipping over the edge, the hand let go. I scrambled back, gasping for air, and when I looked up, the quarry was still. No ripples, no figure, nothing. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I ran, tearing through the woods, branches clawing in my arms and face. When I finally made it back to my car, I locked the doors and sat there, trembling, staring at the tree line. I haven't been back to the woods since, but the letters haven't stopped. The most recent one came this morning. "It's your turn now." And taped to the back of the letter was a Polaroid. It was a picture of me, standing at the edge of the quarry, smiling. Let's start a new story. Part of my morning. That fleeting moment when the coffee pot gurgles its last drops, and the hum of the fridge becomes the loudest sound in the room. It was a quiet I usually welcomed, a stillness before the rush of the day. But that morning, the quiet felt crowded. I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed deeper than usual, like they were pressing themselves into the corners of the room, trying to stay hidden. Or the faint, almost imperceptible tick of the clock on the wall, a clock I was certain had been battery dead for months. The moment passed quickly. My phone buzzed with a meeting reminder, and I forced myself back into the rhythm of life. But the feeling stuck with me, like the ghost of a song you can't quite place. The second time I was in my car, I was driving home late from work, headlights cutting through the fog that had rolled in like a slow, creeping tide. The streets were empty, unusually so, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful in its way. Then, at an intersection, I saw it. A man, standing under the flickering glow of a street lamp. He was dressed in a dark coat, collar turned up against the cold, his hands jammed into his pockets. He wasn't looking at me, just staring down the road as though waiting for something or someone. The light turned green, and I drove past. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart stuttered. He was standing under the next street lamp now. I hadn't seen him move, hadn't seen him cross the distance. He was just there. I pressed the gas harder, speeding toward home. The mirror tilted so I couldn't see behind me anymore. By the time I reached my driveway, my hands were shaking. The man didn't follow. At least I didn't think he had. That night, I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, something I hadn't done in years. By the third time, the small, strange moments were piling up like debris in a stream. The radio in my car started picking up static between stations, faint whispers threading through the noise. My phone would vibrate with phantom notifications, messages that disappeared the moment I unlocked the screen. And the shadows, they were wrong. I'd catch them flickering in my peripheral vision, darker and sharper than they should have been. But when I turned to look, they were perfectly still. Then came the knocking. It started faint, almost polite. A single knock at my front door, then nothing. The first time, I thought it was a package delivery and opened the door without thinking. But there was nothing there, just the empty street, stretching out under the pale wash of the streetlights. The knocking continued over the next few days. Always a single knock. Always when I was alone. It didn't matter if it was morning, afternoon, or night. It would come when the silence grew too thick, like it was waiting for just the right moment to slip in. One evening, I tried ignoring it. The knock came, sharp and deliberate, but I stayed on the couch, gripping the remote in one hand and my phone in the other. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, willing it to stay closed. Then came the second knock, and the third. It didn't stop this time. The knocks came faster, harder, until it sounded like something was slamming against the door. I jumped up, shouting, "Who's there?" The noise stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I crept to the door, every step feeling like a bad decision, and pressed my eye to the peephole. At first, I thought no one was there. Then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the night, standing just outside the circle of light cast by the porch lamp. Its outline was human, sort of, but its edges blurred and flickered like static on an old TV. I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to run. But the shadow didn't move. It was waiting. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the door. The paper was yellowed, the edges frayed as though it had been handled too many times. The writing was jagged and uneven, scrawled in a language I didn't recognize. But at the bottom, in faint, shaky letters, was one phrase I understood. "Come see." I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. The knocking stopped after that, replaced by something worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find my bedroom window open, the curtains swaying gently in a wind I couldn't feel. The shadows on the walls grew longer, stretching toward me like reaching hands. And then one night I saw it again, the shadow from the door. It was in my room, standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It leaned closer, and for the first time I saw its face, or what should have been a face. It was mine, a warped, hollow version of me, its features twisted and wrong. It didn't speak. It just smiled, a jagged, unnatural grin that stretched too wide, and then it was gone. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The notes keep coming, the same message written over and over. Come see. I don't know where it wants me to go, but I'm starting to think I'll find out, whether I want to or not. The shadows are growing bolder. And now, when I look in the mirror, my reflection doesn't blink when I do.